On a cold February night in 1953, in a quiet adobe house in Taos, New Mexico, the golden light of a bedside lamp flickered over the motionless figure of Millicent Rogers. The heiress who once glittered through Europe's salons and New York's soirees had drifted beyond the reach of her mirrors, leaving only the soft rustle of silk and the faint scent of gardenias in the still air. Welcome, dear listener, to Timeless History Documents. Tell us when and where you are listening, for we are bound across time by memory. Subscribe and let this story join your night, breathing gently across distance and years. They said she was born beneath a fortunate star, and perhaps she was. For when Millicent Rogers entered the world in 1902, the heavens above Manhattan gleamed with the pale gold of a winter morning, and the house of her father, Henry Huddleston Rogers, Jr., was already heavy with the scent of oil wealth and expectation. Outside, the clamor of carriages and the new hum of automobiles marked the pulse of an America rising toward modernity, its skyline climbing higher with each ambition, each fortune. Inside, the Rogers home stood quiet, its curtains drawn against the wind that swept from the Hudson, its rooms polished to a sheen that reflected the solemn pride of the Standard Oil dynasty. In those halls, wealth was not merely possession, it was legacy, burden, and chain. Millicent's grandfather, a titan among titans, had been one of the architects of the oil empire that powered the 20th century's beginning. His shadow was long, falling even upon the cradle of a newborn girl who had not yet learned to breathe without effort. Doctors worried for her fragile heart, her delicate lungs, and her mother, Mary Benjamin Rogers, herself a woman of fierce beauty and intellect, held her daughter close with a kind of reverent fear. Every sigh seemed too precious to lose, yet within that frail body stirred a curious defiance, an ember that would, in time, become the fire of her life. Even as a child, Millicent showed a restless spirit, one that the strict etiquette of her world could not tame. The Rogers estate was vast, the gardens symmetrical and precise, yet she would wander beyond the trimmed hedges to the wilder edges, where the grass grew uneven and the air smelled of damp earth instead of perfume. She would gather small stones, bits of twigs, and weave them into patterns, early tokens of the artistic eye that would later fascinate designers and artists across continents. At dinner, she was expected to sit upright, her silver spoon perfectly aligned beside the plate, her words few, her tone polite. Yet even in silence, her eyes spoke. Of questions not meant for drawing rooms, of dreams that belonged to another world. Servants whispered that she often slipped away to the attic, where she would stare for hours at her reflection in an old mirror, as though searching not for her own image, but for some secret waiting behind the glass. It was said that her mother, too, carried the ache of beauty, that mixture of admiration and loneliness that accompanies those too finely made for their surroundings. In the great portraits that hung above the marble staircases, Millicent's lineage was a gallery of composure, of men whose faces were chiseled by industry and women whose elegance masked endurance. Perhaps that is where Millicent first learned the art of disguise, not deceit, but self-preservation within the endless gaze of society. The tutors came and went, teaching her the languages of Europe, the histories of empires, the music of Bach and Chopin. Yet Millicent absorbed them not as lessons, but as keys to other rooms, rooms she longed to walk into, far from the predictable rhythm of wealth. When she read poetry, she traced the verses with her fingers, as though touching a hidden pulse beneath the paper. The world she lived in was heavy with expectation. The world she imagined was made of air and motion, of color and sound, where a woman might be more than a daughter, a wife, a name. Outside her window, the city changed. The hum of machines grew louder, the scent of coal mingled with rain. She would watch from her balcony, fascinated by the figures below, workers, newsboys, street vendors. They lived lives of struggle, yes, but also of freedom. Her world, gilded though it was, often felt airless. It is said that privilege can feel like imprisonment when one's soul belongs elsewhere, and Millicent's belonged everywhere but in the drawing room. As the years turned, the child with the fragile heart became a young woman of striking presence. Her beauty was not of softness, but of angles and contrasts, like light refracted through glass. Her gaze could be distant, her laughter rare, but when she smiled, those around her felt the sudden warmth of sunlight breaking through a clouded morning. The photographers of her youth captured her as society wished her to be, poised, demure, the perfect heiress. Yet in her private sketches, she drew faces that seemed haunted, hands reaching for something unseen. Perhaps she already knew that her destiny would not be one of quiet comfort. The whispers of rebellion had already taken root in her imagination. The notion that life, to be lived fully, must risk the scandal of sincerity. Her parents worried. The newspapers adored her. Suitors began to arrive with measured politeness. But beneath the silk dresses and the diamond pins, her heart beat in a rhythm too wild for the salons of Fifth Avenue. One evening, as the family gathered for dinner, she refused to wear the pearls laid out for her by her mother's maid. Instead, she appeared wearing a crude silver chain she had found in a craftsman's stall downtown. Her mother's disapproval was sharp but unspoken. The gesture was small, almost childish, yet it marked the beginning of a lifelong defiance, an insistence that beauty could come from imperfection, that value could dwell outside the vaults of gold. There's a photograph from those years, taken in the garden of the Rogers estate. Millicent stands beside a marble fountain, her dress pale as mist, her hair caught by the wind. Her eyes, though turned toward the camera, seem to look beyond it, toward something just out of reach. Behind her, the water falls in a steady rhythm, catching the afternoon light in fragments. If one looks closely, the reflection of that falling light trembles upon her skin, as though the world were already trying to claim her, to pull her toward its shifting brilliance. In that image, the future seems to whisper, of journeys yet to come, of loves and losses, of reinvention and return. The child who once searched her reflection for truth would one day step beyond mirrors entirely into a life that would both dazzle and wound her. But for now, she stands in stillness between innocence and awakening, beneath the unblinking gaze of the family legacy. And somewhere in the distance, the wind stirs the leaves, carrying with it the scent of change. The wind that had carried the scent of change through the garden seemed to linger, curling softly through the years that followed, whispering to Millicent of worlds far beyond the carved wood of her family's estate. The silver chain she once wore in quiet rebellion would later glimmer like an omen, for she would adorn herself not only with jewels of precious stone, but with the invisible ornaments of curiosity and defiance. And yet, before she could escape the long corridors of inheritance, she would learn the delicate ache of fragility that marked her every breath. From childhood, the doctors had warned of her weak heart, the murmurs in her chest that frightened her mother and confined her often to rooms filled with sunlight and silence. It was within those sunlit confinements that Millicent's imagination began to unfold, painting, reading, daydreaming of oceans and cathedrals, of fabrics that whispered and faces she had never seen. Illness taught her stillness, but also an acute sensitivity to beauty, to the details others might overlook, the vibration of light across a vase, the movement of dust in a golden beam, the distant hum of life she could not yet join. She would sit by her window and sketch, not flowers or landscapes, as was expected of a young lady of breeding, but forms that bent and twisted in strange rhythms, abstract shapes that seemed to contain a language only she understood. Her father's footsteps in the hallway were the measured cadence of power, of business conducted in dark suits and quiet tones. Yet Millicent's inner world throbbed with color and sound. Her mother, seeing this, alternated between pride and worry. In the circles of the wealthy, imagination was tolerated only if it was decorative, never subversive. But Millicent's imagination was already restless. It was seeking meaning in the margins, in the imperfections of life. In the long afternoons, her governess would read aloud from the great European novels, and Millicent would close her eyes, listening not for the story, but for the breath between the sentences, for the emotion hidden beneath the polite words. It was there, in that silence, that she sensed something profound about human longing, something that would haunt her, and later drive her to chase love in its most impossible forms. When she was 15, the family visited Newport, and there, amid the glittering summer of America's privileged coast, she saw the delicate structure of society revealed in all its contradictions. The women with their parasols, the men with their measured laughter, all caught within the dance of appearance and propriety. It was beautiful, and it was false. She began to understand that her wealth was both blessing and barrier. It offered her everything, yet nothing she truly desired. The pearls, the dresses, the carriages. They were like petals on a flower that had already begun to wither in her mind. What she craved was something she could not name, a sense of belonging that no ballroom could provide. Her diary from those years, though mostly lost, contained fragments that spoke of this yearning, small phrases written in a flowing hand. The world feels too loud. I dream of silence that breathes. I am tired of being admired, each line a quiet rebellion against the role carved out for her. And so, her health, her beauty, and her solitude wove together into the fabric of her early womanhood. The doctors prescribed rest. Her mother insisted upon decorum. But Millicent began to use her frailty as a kind of shield, a reason to withdraw, to think, to imagine her own script. It is strange how illness can sometimes grant a certain kind of freedom, the permission to drift beyond expectation. She began to read philosophy and art history, to study paintings and the language of design, to understand that form was a kind of poetry. She became fascinated by the way light touched surfaces, the way texture could convey emotion. Her world, though small, was intensely alive. It was during one of those long recoveries that she first discovered the power of transformation through adornment. Confined to her room, she began to craft small trinkets from bits of ribbon, metal, and thread, objects that seemed to carry fragments of her spirit. Each piece was a silent conversation with herself, a question about what beauty meant when stripped of wealth. Perhaps it was here that the seed was planted for the later Millicent, the woman who would wear silver Navajo cuffs beside diamonds, who would turn her body into a living gallery of cultures and histories. But for now, she was simply a girl, pale and watchful, watching time unfold through her window like a slow procession of seasons. The years between childhood and debut came quietly, with lessons, tutors, and the delicate choreography of preparation. Her family expected perfection, and Millicent delivered it with an almost serene detachment. She learned to walk as though floating, to speak with grace, to conceal her thoughts behind the soft glow of civility. Yet beneath that calm exterior, her mind was alive with questions that no etiquette book could answer. Why must a woman be admired but never understood? Why must beauty be ornamental, not expressive? Why must wealth be silent rather than creative? Each question burned faintly within her, like a candle flickering in a draught. And when, at last, she stood before society for her debut, dressed in ivory silk, the world saw only radiance. They did not see the pulse of resistance that ran through her veins. The orchestra played, the chandeliers shimmered, and Millicent smiled with the quiet grace of someone who had already begun to look past the room, past the polite laughter, towards something infinite. She danced with the sons of bankers, with young diplomats and naval officers, each conversation perfectly measured, each glance carefully received. But she felt it, the emptiness beneath the glitter. the performance of belonging without the comfort of being. That night, when the carriages departed and the candles were snuffed out, Millicent stood before her mirror and removed her gloves slowly. Her reflection looked back at her, beautiful and distant, a stranger cloaked in silk. She touched the surface of the glass as if to ask, quietly, who she truly was. Somewhere beyond that reflection, the girl from the garden still lingered, the one who had gathered twigs and stones, who had believed that beauty might live outside of rules. The sound of the city rose faintly through the open window, a carriage wheel against cobblestone, a distant piano, the soft murmur of life continuing. She turned away, but the image in the mirror remained, suspended like a thought unfinished, waiting to follow her into the next chapter of her restless life. The image in the mirror seemed to follow her, lingering in the glass of train windows, in the surface of rivers, in the glimmer of champagne poured beneath chandeliers. It watched as she stepped across the threshold between youth and womanhood, as the world opened before her like an endless corridor of doors. Behind each door waited a possibility, a promise, or perhaps a trap. Society had already written its script for her. The heiress would marry, host, and preserve her family's name through decorum and continuity. But Millicent, though outwardly compliant, began to sense the dull ache of repetition in that expectation. The polite rituals of calling cards, luncheons, and tea were performances of stillness, and she craved motion. The men around her, handsome, well-educated, safe, spoke of politics, yachts, and stocks. None seemed to speak of the trembling beauty of existence, of the thin veil that separates love from loneliness. And so, while her companions measured life in possessions, Millicent began to measure it in impressions, in the way a sunset could stain the memory more deeply than any gemstone. When her father's business required travel, Millicent often accompanied her mother to Europe, where the old world dazzled her imagination with its contrasts. London, with its gray mist and restrained grandeur, felt like a city that held its breath. Paris, by contrast, shimmered with vitality and suggestion, every street humming with unspoken stories. In Vienna, she heard a violinist play in a cafe and wept quietly, unable to explain to her mother why the melody seemed to open a secret chamber within her heart. Europe, to Millicent, was not merely geography. It was a mirror to her inner landscape, a place where beauty and melancholy walked hand in hand. She began to sketch again, this time not objects but moods, shadows along a bridge, a curl of smoke, a face half-turned from light. She wrote in her travel journal about the strange kinship she felt with cities that carried both splendor and decay. In Rome, one evening, at a gathering of diplomats and artists, she met a man whose presence unsettled her. He was not wealthy, not particularly handsome, but he spoke with a kind of conviction she had never encountered among her peers. He spoke of art as if it were a living force, capable of reshaping the human soul. For hours, they walked along the Tiber, discussing truth, beauty, and the futility of ambition. When he left for Florence the next morning, he gave her a small silver charm, a crude, hand-beaten pendant shaped like a star. It was imperfect, slightly asymmetrical, yet she treasured it more than the jewels locked away in her mother's safe. It seemed to represent everything she desired: authenticity, impermanence, the trace of human touch. Her parents, of course, disapproved of such friendships. The Rogers family was polite, but vigilant, aware that the world's gaze was always upon them. Scandal was to be avoided, individuality managed with discretion. But Millicent's inner world was beginning to resist such confinement. Her health improved briefly, enough for her to travel alone under the watch of a companion, and in those brief intervals of solitude, she learned something profound about herself. She did not seek rebellion for its own sake, but rather for the sake of truth. She wanted her life to feel real, unmediated, unarranged. Yet even this desire carried within it the seeds of tragedy, for reality, when pursued by one unshielded by illusion, often proves unbearable. When she returned to New York, her reputation had subtly changed. She was no longer merely the Rogers heiress. She was spoken of as cultured, unpredictable, charming in ways that both intrigued and unsettled the men of her class. The papers began to mention her name alongside the newest fashions, the latest social gatherings. Photographers sought her presence, not only for her beauty, but for the unspoken mystery she carried, the sense that she was always elsewhere, thinking of something beyond the room. Women admired her composure, men found her elusive, but Millicent herself felt increasingly alienated, trapped in a role she could not escape. It was during these years that she began to see fashion not as vanity, but as communication. If words could not express her inner rebellion, perhaps fabrics and shapes could. She altered her gowns, mixed textures, combined inherited pearls with unconventional materials. At one dinner, she appeared wearing an antique shawl from Spain, its dark embroidery offset by a single scarlet rose pinned at her shoulder. It was audacious, yet somehow perfect. The older women whispered disapproval, the younger ones took notes. In that gesture, Millicent had begun to turn style into statement long before such acts would be called modern. But her beauty, her intelligence, and her mystery drew more than admiration. They drew pursuit. Among her suitors were noblemen from Europe, young heirs from New York, and even an artist whose gaze seemed to read her too deeply. She responded to each with politeness but with distance, as if testing the sincerity of their affection. Some left offended, others more enchanted than before. Her parents urged her to settle, to marry respectably, to secure her position. Yet Millicent hesitated. Perhaps she sensed that love, for her, could never be ordinary, that it would come, when it did, not as comfort, but as storm. In 1924, she met her first husband, an Austrian nobleman of impeccable lineage. The match seemed ideal, an alliance of wealth and title, east and west. Society rejoiced, the newspapers celebrated, and for a time, Millicent appeared radiant. But those who knew her well sensed a tension behind the glow. The marriage, though elegant, was hollow. Her husband admired her but did not understand her. He loved the image, not the woman. Their conversations were courteous, their silences vast. She tried to fulfill her role, to embody grace and composure, yet the loneliness deepened. In the great halls of their European home, she walked like a ghost draped in couture. And then came the realization, as inevitable as dawn breaking through fog. She had mistaken admiration for love, security for meaning. The life she had built in marble and lace began to crumble inward. The same restless wind that once stirred the leaves of her childhood garden now whispered through the corridors of her marriage, reminding her that she had traded freedom for form. When she finally left, it was without spectacle, without bitterness. She simply packed her belongings, books, sketches, trinkets, the silver star pendant, and departed into the world once more. That departure marked the true beginning of Millicent Rogers' life, as the world would come to know it. Not as a daughter, not as a wife, but as a woman shaped by longing, forever reaching for authenticity amid illusion. The trains carried her through cities she had once visited as a girl, but now the air tasted different. Less of wonder, more of resolve. In her reflection upon the train window, the same eyes gazed back, but the innocence had faded. She was no longer searching for herself in mirrors. She was preparing to live as one. Outside, the passing landscape blurred into a river of light, the wind still rising and falling like breath against the glass. It would follow her to Paris, to the ateliers of artists and the salons of dreamers, where her name would soon shimmer in a new kind of scandal. The train that carried her across Europe hummed like a living creature beneath her feet, its rhythm echoing the new tempo of her life, unsettled, searching, alive. Through the window, the countryside dissolved into a tapestry of green and gold, villages folding one into another, each roofline fading like a forgotten promise. Millicent sat wrapped in a shawl of soft gray wool, her eyes reflecting the shifting light. Somewhere between Paris and Vienna, she began to sense the quiet joy of being unanchored, no longer defined by household or title. She was alone, and that aloneness, though tinged with fear, felt sacred. For the first time, she belonged not to a family name or a husband's expectation, but to the invisible pulse of her own becoming. When she arrived in Paris, the city seemed to breathe in rhythm with her heart. It was the late 1920s, and Paris was awake with invention. Painters and poets crowded the cafes of Montparnasse, their voices weaving through the smoke like music. Women cut their hair short, wore loose dresses that defied corsets, and spoke of freedom not as scandal, but as necessity. Millicent found herself among them, at first an observer, then slowly, inevitably, a participant. She no longer moved within the quiet circles of aristocracy, but within the restless constellations of creativity. Her beauty, always striking, now took on a new intensity, something uncontained, slightly defiant. The artists saw in her not a socialite, but a muse, a woman whose face carried both privilege and pain. In the studios of Montparnasse, she sat for painters who tried to capture the shadow in her gaze. They said her expression held the weight of another century, as though she had been born into the wrong time. She listened to their talk of form and abstraction, the way color could speak where language failed. And as they painted, she thought about her own life as composition, how she, too, rearranged pieces of herself to create meaning. At night, she would return to her apartment, its small rooms filled with the scent of turpentine and fading flowers, and she would write by candlelight. Fragments of thought, half-finished poems, notes to lovers she had not yet met. Each word was a thread in the vast tapestry of her inner life, woven in solitude and illuminated by longing. It was during one of these Parisian seasons that she met the man who would change the way the world saw her, an American, like herself, but one who had renounced the rigidity of their homeland for the intoxication of European bohemia. They met at a party in Saint-Germain, a gathering of artists and exiles where laughter and cigarette smoke filled the air like incense. He was drawn to her not by beauty alone, but by the aura of quiet rebellion that seemed to follow her. They spoke little that first night, yet something unspoken passed between them, a recognition perhaps of two souls untethered from expectation. Their affair was brief, but it burned with the intensity of compressed years. They wandered through Paris as if through a dream, through the arcades of the Palais Royal, the narrow alleys of the Latin Quarter, the bridges that crossed the Seine like suspended sighs. He taught her to see the city not as a spectacle, but as an organism of desire and decay. She, in turn, taught him the beauty of restraint, the elegance of silence. In cafes, they shared secrets in low tones, their reflections merging in the windows. Yet, as with all things too bright, it could not last. He was restless, always chasing another horizon, another muse. When he left, she did not weep. She watched his figure disappear into the mist of the Gare de Lyon and thought only of the strange sweetness of impermanence. After his departure, Millicent began to travel again, as if movement itself could quiet the ache within her. She drifted through Italy, Austria, Switzerland, always surrounded by people yet profoundly alone. Her letters to her mother became shorter, her handwriting looser, more abstract. She wrote of architecture, of color, of moments. The sky in Florence, she once wrote, looks like porcelain about to crack. These journeys, though filled with beauty, revealed the hollowness that often follows freedom. To live without boundaries is also to live without rest. By the time she returned to America, the decade had turned. The world was changing. The music, the fashion, the very texture of modern life. Millicent stepped back into New York society as if into a familiar play whose lines she no longer believed. She was greeted with admiration, curiosity, and a trace of unease. The newspapers called her radiant, unconventional, mysterious. They wrote of her Parisian years with fascination, framing her not as a wanderer, but as a figure of allure. Yet behind the photographs and the polite laughter, she carried the invisible fatigue of one who has seen too much and understood too deeply. It was during these years that she began to refine what would later become her signature sensibility, a merging of luxury and authenticity, of formality and instinct. She worked with designers not as a patron but as a collaborator, sketching ideas, altering fabrics, questioning proportions. Her sense of style became a language of philosophy. Beauty, she believed, should never be static. It should breathe, evolve, surprise. When she appeared at events, her ensembles seemed to tell stories of deserts and palaces, of old worlds and new beginnings. People said she dressed like a painting, and perhaps she did, for every choice of color and ornament was deliberate, layered with meaning. But even as her legend grew, the loneliness persisted. Her lovers multiplied, yet each left her with the same quiet ache, a reminder that admiration could never substitute for intimacy. She wanted love not as possession, but as recognition, a meeting of equals. And yet, in her world, equality was rare. The men who courted her loved her beauty, her wealth, her enigma, but few dared to meet her in the space between words. And so she began to turn inward again, seeking solace in art, in the slow creation of identity. In the summer of 1931, she traveled once more to Europe, not as debutante nor as wife, but as woman untethered. On a clear afternoon in Venice, she stood by the edge of the lagoon, watching the light scatter across the water in shards of gold. The city seemed suspended between decay and eternity, a place where beauty had learned to coexist with ruin. As the bells of San Giorgio rang in the distance, Millicent felt an inexplicable calm, as though she had glimpsed the pattern beneath her restless years. Perhaps life, like art, was not meant to be perfected but lived as a sequence of gestures, each one sincere, each one incomplete. That evening, as the last light faded from the canal, she turned away from the water and walked toward the narrow streets, her footsteps echoing softly against the stone. Somewhere, a violin played, a familiar melody from her youth, and for a moment she smiled, knowing that her journey, though aimless in form, was leading her toward the deeper expression she had always sought. The reflection of the lamps in the water trembled like memory itself, and she walked on into the gathering dusk. The violin's notes lingered in her mind long after she left Venice behind, echoing softly through the train compartments, the hotel rooms, and the quiet hours between dawn and sleep. Music, she often said, was the only language that could reach her without intrusion. It was in those notes, those tremulous intervals of sound and silence, that she felt the shadow of understanding, the thing that eluded words and lovers alike. As the train wound its way northward through the Alps, she thought of the choices that had led her here, the lineage she had inherited, the wealth she had resisted, the freedom she had demanded, and the solitude that followed like an uninvited companion. Snow was falling outside, light and deliberate, turning the world into a pale tapestry of stillness. Inside her compartment, Millicent sketched idly, her lines tracing the outline of mountains dissolving into clouds. Perhaps she saw herself in that vanishing line between form and formlessness, a woman suspended between definition and disappearance. She returned to Austria for a time, to the country of her failed marriage, though not to the house itself. Vienna was still elegant, though haunted now by the unease that drifted through Europe like an invisible frost. The world was shifting again, quietly, ominously, as though history were drawing breath for something vast and terrible. Yet within that uncertainty, Millicent found herself drawn once more to beauty. She attended operas, exhibitions, salons, moving through each like a ghost wrapped in satin. Her name still opened doors, but her eyes no longer lingered on the glitter within them. It was not admiration she sought now, but essence, the soul of things beneath their surface. It was in Vienna that she met a sculptor whose studio smelled of stone dust and turpentine. He was older, his hands rough from years of chiseling marble, and his face bore the calm of one who understands time. They spoke little at first. Their conversations were built from gestures, the tilt of a head, the pause before a word. She visited often, watching him work, the mallet's rhythm merging with the soft hush of falling dust. He spoke of form as if it were a kind of faith, of how the act of creation demanded surrender, not control. His words touched something deep within her. For years, she had curated her image, sculpted herself through fashion and poise, yet she had never thought of beauty as an act of surrender. The sculptor showed her that imperfection was not failure, but evidence of life. One afternoon, she sat for him as he molded clay, his fingers tracing the delicate lines of her face. The studio was cold, the light muted by frost, and the silence between them seemed as intimate as breath. When he finished, she stood before the unfinished likeness, her own features emerging from raw matter. It was strange to see herself rendered not as an ideal, but as something human, flawed, transient. She felt both exposed and liberated. "It is not you," he said quietly, "but what you are trying to find." That night, as she walked back through the snow, she realized that she had been searching not for love, not even for freedom, but for truth. The truth of feeling alive, of being wholly herself in a world that demanded masks. Her time with the sculptor did not last. Like so many of her connections, it faded gently, without bitterness, dissolving into memory. Yet its imprint remained. In later years, she would remember his hands shaping the clay and think of how each person she met had, in some way, molded her spirit. She carried those impressions like invisible jewelry, unseen but deeply felt. When she returned once more to America, the city seemed louder, harsher, its rhythm discordant after the stillness of Europe. The towers of New York had grown higher, the lights brighter, but she felt detached from their glitter. Her name still commanded attention, but she no longer sought it. She began to spend her days in quieter pursuits, reading, collecting art, studying design. It was during this period that her relationship with style reached its most articulate form. She no longer followed trends, she dictated them. Designers came to her for inspiration, drawn not merely to her beauty, but to her instinct for balance, her sense of proportion that seemed to come from some deeper harmony between body and spirit. She mixed materials without hesitation, velvet with metal, lace with leather, ancient amulets beside modern jewels. To her, every garment was a composition, a dialogue between texture and emotion. The press described her as daring, avant-garde, scandalous. But she was not chasing novelty. She was translating her inner life into visible form. And yet, as her public image grew more vivid, her private world began to dim. Behind the photographs and the laughter lay exhaustion, the fatigue of a soul constantly reinventing itself. Her romantic entanglements became more turbulent, more transient. She fell in love easily, but rarely found peace within it. Men admired her brilliance, her elegance, her mystery, but she longed for someone who could see the quiet child still wandering the edges of her father's garden. That vulnerability, so carefully hidden, was both her charm and her curse. When love failed, she turned again to art, to the silent companionship of objects and images that asked nothing of her. In 1939, as the world teetered on the brink of war, Millicent returned once more to Europe, defying the fear that gripped so many. She said she wanted to see the continent she loved before it changed forever. In Paris, the air was thick with tension, the cafes quieter now, their windows dimmed. She moved through the city like a phantom of its golden age, her presence both nostalgic and prophetic. The artists she had once known were scattered, some fleeing, some hiding, some already lost. She attended small gatherings, not of celebration but of remembrance. In those rooms filled with smoke and melancholy, she felt again the fragility of all that she cherished: art, beauty, humanity itself. On her last night in Paris before her departure, she stood by the Seine beneath a pale moon. The river was swollen with spring rain, its surface trembling like a mirror disturbed by breath. She thought of the faces she had loved, the cities she had walked, the fragments of herself she had left behind in each. The war would come, the world would change, and she would return home to a country she no longer fully understood. Yet beneath her sadness was a strange clarity, a sense that her life, for all its disorder, had not been wasted. She had lived as few dared to, openly, vulnerably, beautifully. The wind lifted her hair, carrying with it the faint scent of rain and lilacs. Somewhere behind her, a clock struck midnight, and the sound seemed to echo not in time, but in memory. She turned, her footsteps light upon the stone, and began the long walk back toward her hotel. The river followed her with its quiet murmur, as though whispering an unfinished story that would soon lead her away from Europe forever. The river's murmur followed her all the way back to America, a faint echo of all that had been left behind: the laughter of Parisian nights, the stillness of the sculptor's studio, the shimmering fragments of a life lived between continents. When she stepped once more onto American soil, the world itself had changed. It was the 1940s now, and the air carried both the fever of war and the hum of industry. The nation was rising, restless and iron-hearted, and the old aristocracy to which Millicent belonged seemed like a remnant of another age. Yet she, who had long resisted the constraints of her class, found herself oddly at peace amid the upheaval. For the first time, the world appeared to move as she had always moved, recklessly, passionately, toward an uncertain beauty. Her return to New York was not triumphant, but contemplative. The city pulsed with new energy, its skyline hard and glittering, its rhythm impatient. Millicent, now in her 40s, possessed a serenity that confounded those who had once known her as the restless debutante. The parties continued, the photographers called, yet she no longer belonged to that bright surface. Her style had matured into something elemental, less ornament, more essence. She wore sleek fabrics cut with precision, jewelry that seemed to speak of ancient stories. In the mirror-lined ballrooms of Manhattan, she was not merely fashionable, she was mythic, a figure half in this world and half in another. It was during these years that she became not just a muse, but a creator in her own right. Her collaborations with designers grew bolder, her vision more articulate. She had the rare gift of seeing connections between worlds that others believed incompatible: tribal patterns and couture silhouettes, peasant weaves and diamonds, silver crafted by hand beside gold shaped by machines. In her hands, opposites harmonized. She did not wear clothing as adornment but as declaration, each piece a small rebellion against uniformity. When asked where her inspiration came from, she would smile faintly and say, "From what refuses to match." That phrase, both cryptic and profound, became her quiet manifesto. But beneath her composed exterior, the old ache persisted, the longing for intimacy, for understanding. The world adored her but seldom knew her. Her lovers came and went like seasons, each leaving behind traces of warmth and ruin. There were actors whose charm dissolved in vanity, artists whose intensity turned cruel, and men of title who mistook her depth for danger. Yet through it all, she remained gracious, never bitter, as though accepting that love, for her, could only ever be a fragment, never a whole. She once confided to a friend that she loved too quickly and too abstractly, as if drawn more to the idea of love than its living form. Perhaps that was true, for Millicent's heart, fragile from childhood, had learned to exist in rhythms of distance. When the war deepened, she began to use her wealth and influence for purpose. She donated generously, organized aid for refugees, and supported soldiers far from home. There was a dignity in her compassion, quiet, unadvertised. She did not seek to be seen as charitable. She sought to feel useful. For the first time, her energies turned outward rather than inward, and in that turning, she found a brief harmony. Friends noticed the change. She seemed calmer, more grounded, as though the chaos of the world had finally mirrored the turbulence within her, making her contradictions feel natural. Yet even this equilibrium could not hold forever. In the years that followed, America emerged victorious but transformed, and so did Millicent. The city she returned to after the war was younger, louder, less reverent toward the old order. A new generation of women was beginning to move in ways she had once been scolded for, working, traveling, dressing without permission. She watched them with something like pride, recognizing in their freedom the seeds she had planted decades earlier. Still, there was a sense of displacement. The glamour that once defined her world now seemed excessive, almost hollow. She began to feel drawn to silence again, to wide horizons and uncluttered air. It was her son, Peter, who gave shape to that longing. Their relationship, tender and complex, had always been the most constant thread in her life. She adored him fiercely, perhaps too fiercely, as if he carried within him not just her hope, but her redemption. He, in turn, loved her with the protective devotion of one who senses fragility behind elegance. In their letters, they spoke not only as mother and son, but as two souls bound by an unspoken melancholy. When he wrote of the war, of comrades lost and disillusionment gained, she listened without correction, offering instead the comfort of understanding. It was through him that she began to dream of a simpler existence, far from the marble and crystal that had once defined her. She started to travel inward toward the heart of her own country, seeking a landscape untainted by luxury. The restless hunger that had carried her through Europe now led her westward, to the open spaces beyond the cities. It was there, in the untamed light of New Mexico, that she felt something stir, a recognition, ancient and wordless. The land itself seemed to speak to her, not in the language of society or fashion, but in silence and color. The vastness of the desert, the unbroken sky, the rhythm of wind against rock, all of it felt truer than any ballroom, any Parisian street. Here at last was a world that demanded nothing from her, that allowed her to simply be. She rented a small house in Taos, a place where artists and wanderers gathered, drawn by the purity of its light. The first time she stood on its red earth, she felt an unexpected peace, as though she had arrived at the ending of a long symphony. Her gowns of satin and lace gave way to cotton and turquoise, her diamonds replaced by silver, forged by local hands. The heiress of Standard Oil was shedding her inheritance, layer by layer, until only the woman remained. The townspeople, at first wary of her Eastern glamour, soon came to know her as quiet and kind, a collector of stories as much as of art. In the evenings, she would sit outside beneath the stars, the air cool and dry, the silence vast. The Milky Way stretched across the sky like a path she might one day follow. In that stillness, she thought of her past, not with regret, but with a kind of wonder, that all her searching had led her here, to the place where sound gave way to silence, where beauty no longer needed adornment. She began to collect Native American jewelry and crafts, not as trophies, but as testaments to endurance, to the artistry of those who created without pretense. Her home became a sanctuary of cultures and time, a meeting place of the old and the eternal. And yet, even in that peace, a trace of sadness lingered, the soft awareness that she had found belonging only at the edge of departure. The desert light faded each evening into violet, then into black, and she would listen to the wind moving through the sagebrush, a sound like memory breathing. The world she had left behind grew more distant with each passing season, until it seemed almost a dream. But dreams, she had learned, never fade entirely. They remain, shimmering faintly beneath the surface of silence, waiting for the wind to stir them once more. The wind that crossed the desert came with a voice unlike any she had known before, soft, unending, carrying not the sounds of people or cities, but the whisper of time itself. It was this wind that wrapped around Millicent Rogers as she stood before the vast New Mexican sky, her figure silhouetted against the fading sun. The light at dusk was a living thing here, golden at first, then deepening to amber, and finally to a kind of bruised violet that seemed to hover between worlds. The desert did not flatter her beauty. It stripped it bare, revealing the woman beneath the legend. There were no mirrors here, no chandeliers, no music of orchestras to announce her arrival. The only music was the steady pulse of the earth, the far cry of a hawk, and the rustle of her dress in the wind. For the first time in years, she felt small in a way that brought relief, not fear. In Taos, the days moved slowly, measured by the shifting angles of light on the mountains. Artists and wanderers gathered in small houses with thick adobe walls, their conversations drifting between philosophy and survival. It was here that Millicent found kinship not through wealth or reputation, but through shared solitude. They treated her not as an heiress, but as one of them, a woman seeking meaning in the raw simplicity of the land. Her presence was quiet, unassuming. She walked barefoot sometimes through the dust, her silver bracelets chiming faintly, her hair undone, her eyes reflecting the infinite horizon. People would later recall that she seemed almost transparent, as if the desert had begun to carve her into its image. The native artisans she met fascinated her deeply. Their work, silver turquoise, woven wool, was born from the land itself, shaped by ritual and respect. She spent hours in their company, watching the way their hands moved, the patience in every gesture. In their jewelry, she saw not decoration but story, the echo of rivers, the rhythm of sun and shadow, the persistence of spirit. She began collecting their pieces, not as curiosities, but as living embodiments of truth. Her home soon became a museum of quiet reverence, bracelets and necklaces laid beside ancient pots, fabrics folded with care, the walls adorned, not with portraits of her lineage, but with the textures of another civilization. In those evenings when the desert cooled and the fire crackled softly in her hearth, she would sit with the artisans, sharing food and silence. They spoke little, yet the communication between them was profound. She had spent her life surrounded by words, by talk of society, fashion, art, but here, meaning resided in quiet. She often said that silence was the truest luxury she had ever known, and as she listened to the stories told in fragments of ancestors, of struggle, of endurance, she began to understand something essential, that art was not an escape from life, but its purest reflection. Her health, fragile since childhood, began once again to falter. The altitude and dry air that gave her peace also strained her heart. Some days she would remain indoors, her body weak but her mind lucid, her hands adorned with the very silver she loved. Visitors described the glow of her rooms, candles flickering against whitewashed walls, the faint scent of sage, the soft hum of wind through open windows. It was a world apart from the marble interiors of her youth, and yet it felt more like home than any place she had ever known. When her strength returned, she would ride through the plains, her shawl trailing in the wind, her eyes fixed on the line where the sky met the earth. Millicent's correspondence from this period reveals a rare piece of spirit. She wrote to friends in Europe and New York with warmth, but also with detachment, as though speaking from the other side of a threshold. She no longer envied the glittering lives she once lived. She pitied them. In one letter, she described the desert as the only place where beauty does not perform. That phrase lingered in her mind, and she would often repeat it to visitors who came seeking her opinion on art and fashion. She told them that beauty should not need an audience. that it existed truly only when it belonged to no one. It was in Taos that her legend transformed. Those who came to see her expected glamour and scandal, but found instead a woman serene and luminous, her elegance transfigured by humility. Yet there was still something untamed about her, something that refused to settle entirely into calm. Her laughter, when it came, had the sharpness of wind through canyon rock. Her eyes still held the shimmer of faraway places. She had become a bridge between worlds, the refinement of the East and the rawness of the West, the human and the elemental. Photographers captured her in flowing shawls and heavy silver necklaces, her face half lit, half shadowed. These portraits, more than any of her earlier ones, revealed her essence, a beauty that had learned to endure the erosion of time. Visitors often left her house changed, as if they had glimpsed something sacred. They spoke of the stillness that seemed to emanate from her presence, of the strange feeling that the air itself had slowed around her. She would listen as they spoke of their ambitions and disappointments, her gaze steady, her replies gentle but precise. Sometimes she offered wisdom in fragments. You can lose everything and still keep grace. And sometimes she said nothing at all, allowing silence to complete the thought. Her relationship with her son deepened through distance. Peter visited when he could, bringing with him the noise and pulse of the cities she had left behind. He was fascinated by her transformation, proud yet worried. In her letters to him, she spoke often of the light, how it changed each hour, how it painted the mesas in colors the mind could barely name. It was as if she had replaced society's clamor with nature's language. She told him she had found, at last, a kind of prayer, not written in words, but in color and space. And though he feared for her health, he sensed that she had finally arrived where she was meant to be. But peace, for Millicent, was never simple. Beneath her calm lived the same delicate restlessness that had shaped her since childhood. Some nights, when the desert wind rose suddenly, rattling the doors and filling the air with dust, she would lie awake, remembering. Faces, rooms, perfumes, the sound of rain against Parisian windows, all would return in waves. The past did not haunt her with regret, but with tenderness. She had lived many lives within one, and now, as her body weakened, she carried them all gently within her, as one carries beloved letters tied in a silk ribbon. Toward the end of those years, she began to withdraw further from society. She still welcomed guests, still dressed with quiet elegance, but her energy turned inward, her days governed by reflection and ritual. She collected stones from the riverbeds, arranged them in patterns across her tables, as if mapping the geometry of her own spirit. She spent hours sketching jewelry designs, inspired by the desert, lines of silver echoing the curves of dunes, turquoise set like fragments of sky. Her creations were less adornment than invocation, as though she were trying to translate the silence around her into form. When asked if she missed the world she had left behind, she smiled and said softly, "The world never leaves you. It just changes its voice." On and as the seasons shifted, spring to summer, summer to the thin breath of autumn, she continued to listen, to the wind, to her memories, to the faint eternal rhythm that had followed her from the marble halls of New York to this small sun-bleached house beneath the mountains. In the evenings, when the sun sank low and the mesas burned with a crimson glow, she would sit alone by her window. The sky stretched endlessly before her, and in its vast silence, she felt both vanishing and eternal. Sometimes she would whisper a line from a poem she had once loved. Sometimes she said nothing at all. The desert, ever patient, seemed to understand both. The evenings in Taos deepened like the slow closing of an eyelid, and in that drowsy twilight, Millicent often found herself suspended between memory and dream. The fire in her hearth burned low, painting the walls in trembling shades of amber, and outside the coyotes began their distant lament, thin and sorrowful as the echo of her own heart. The rhythm of her days had become as steady as the pulse of the desert itself. She rose with the sun, her movements deliberate, graceful even in solitude, and by dusk she sat again before the great window that faced the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, watching the last light dissolve over their peaks. The air here was clean and dry, almost ascetic. It paired everything down to essence, color, breath, thought. It was in this paring down that she felt herself nearing something true, something she had sought in every city, every lover, every gown, yet found only now when the world had grown quiet around her. Sometimes, as the shadows lengthened, she would take out her old sketchbooks, those she had carried since girlhood, and trace the faded lines of her own past. There were drawings of faces half-remembered, designs that mingled European ornament with native simplicity, abstract forms that hinted at emotions too complex for speech. She ran her fingers over the paper as though touching the ghosts of her former selves. Each drawing was a life, each curve a memory of one who had reached too far or loved too deeply. The fire popped softly, and the smell of burning cedar mingled with the faint perfume of the oil she sometimes wore, a scent she had brought long ago from Paris. It was as if the two worlds, the polished and the primitive, still coexisted within her, each completing what the other lacked. Visitors continued to come, drawn by curiosity or reverence. Writers, painters, collectors. They arrived expecting the scandalous heiress of rumor and found instead a woman of stillness and quiet humor. Her words had grown slower, her voice softer, as though spoken through distance. She no longer argued, no longer defended her choices. She explained nothing. When asked about her past, she would only smile and say, "It was all necessary." Some found that answer infuriating, others liberating. Yet no one who met her left unchanged. There was something in her gaze, a clarity that came not from certainty, but from long intimacy with doubt. It was the look of one who had made peace with impermanence. Among those who visited was a photographer, young and eager, who begged to capture her image against the desert light. She agreed, though only on the condition that he use no artificial flash, no staging. "Let the sun do the work," she said. "It understands me better." The resulting photographs became legendary. Millicent seated beneath a sky so vast it dwarfed her entirely, her eyes half closed, her jewelry glinting like relics of another age. In one image, the wind lifts a strand of her hair, and her expression, serene, unreadable, seems to hold the entire story of a century. When the photographer showed her the prints, she regarded them silently, then whispered, "I look almost free." Yet freedom for Millicent was never without its shadow. Her health continued to wane, and the long hours of stillness that once nourished her began to weigh heavily on her frail body. There were days when the act of breathing itself seemed an effort, her chest rising shallowly, her heart beating in slow, uncertain intervals. Still, she resisted the suggestion to leave Taos for treatment. She told those who loved her that she wished to remain where the air was honest and the silence kind. "If I must go," she said, "I would rather go beneath this sky." And so she stayed, her days narrowing to a rhythm of sunlight, letters, and small acts of creation. The silver jewelry she designed in those final years bore the mark of her transformation. Gone were the ornate flourishes of her youth. Her pieces had become simple, almost austere. Broad cuffs engraved with patterns of clouds and water, pendants shaped like small moons, earrings that caught the desert light and turned it to flame. When she wore them, she seemed less adorned than illuminated. Visitors marveled at how her presence changed the meaning of these objects, how they seemed to hold something of her spirit. In time, they would become her signature, her legacy. the visible proof of a soul that had fused elegance with elemental truth. In the evenings, when fatigue pressed upon her, she would sometimes speak softly to the empty room, as if addressing the long corridor of her own past. "It was all so loud," she once murmured, "and I kept mistaking noise for life." Then, after a pause, she added, "But even noise has its beauty once you've learned silence." Her words floated into the still air and vanished, leaving behind only the faint hiss of wind against adobe. Her letters to Peter during this time carried both tenderness and premonition. She wrote of the clouds as if they were sentient beings, of the colors that changed with each hour, of the quiet joy she found in ordinary things, the smell of rain, the sound of distant thunder, the feel of woven cloth beneath her hands. "The desert," she wrote to him, "has taught me that everything is temporary, even sorrow. It burns away like mist at sunrise." He worried, of course, sensing the decline in her handwriting, the faint tremor in her sentences, but she reassured him gently. "I am not unhappy," she wrote, "only unfinished." Winter came early that year, dusting the mountains with snow that gleamed pale under the moon. The cold made her breathing shallow, yet she refused to light the fire too high, saying she preferred to feel the air move through the house. Each night she sat a little longer by her window, wrapped in shawls, the sky above her a cathedral of stars. To those who saw her then, she seemed almost translucent, her features carved by light and shadow until she appeared less human than spirit. The local children called her the Silver Lady, and when they passed her house, they would lower their voices as if in the presence of something sacred. It was during one of those frozen nights that she fell ill. The doctor from town came riding through the snow, his horse's hooves muffled against the drifts, but there was little he could do. She lay in her bed, the quilts piled high, her silver bracelet stacked at her wrist like talismans. Her breathing was shallow but peaceful. When asked if she wished to send for anyone, she shook her head. "There's no one missing," she whispered. Outside, the wind had stilled, and the moonlight poured through the window, soft and golden. For a long time she stared at it, her eyes reflecting its glow. Those who were present said she smiled faintly, as though recognizing an old friend. Then she exhaled once, lightly, easily, and the stillness deepened. By morning, the sun had returned, laying its warmth gently over the adobe walls. The air smelled faintly of cedar smoke and silver polish. In her room, the fire had gone out, and the bracelets at her wrist gleamed softly in the light. The desert beyond the window stretched endless and unchanged, as though nothing extraordinary had happened, and yet everything had. The woman who had danced through the glittering halls of Europe, who had defied the silence of wealth and the vanity of beauty, now belonged entirely to the quiet she had sought all her life. Later that week, the artisans she had befriended came to her house. They built a small altar of stones and laid her favorite pieces of jewelry upon it: silver cuffs, turquoise rings, a necklace shaped like a star. The wind rose softly, lifting the dust into the air, and for a moment the light shimmered across the horizon as if she were still walking there, just beyond sight, her figure dissolving into the gold of afternoon. For days after her passing, the desert seemed to hold its breath, as if reluctant to accept that she was gone. The sky over Taos was a pale, endless blue, and the air carried the faint scent of wood smoke mixed with sage. Those who had known Millicent spoke softly, almost reverently, as though afraid that words might disturb the fragile stillness she had left behind. Her house, filled with the objects of her life, woven blankets, silverwork, sketches, and the quiet glow of worn books, felt less like a place of absence than of lingering presence. The light that poured through the windows still seemed to search for her, to rest for a moment upon her favorite chair, upon the jewelry arranged on her desk, upon the half-finished letter that lay beside it. Everything in that house seemed to breathe in slow memory. Her death was gentle, but her absence was vast. The townspeople who had once regarded her as an exotic presence now spoke of her with affection, calling her La Señora de la Luz, the Lady of the Light. They said that when the evening sun spread across the mesas, the color of the earth turned silver for a few moments, as though her spirit had brushed it in passing. Among the artists of Taos, she had become more than a benefactor. She had become a legend. They remembered her laughter, her silences, her way of seeing beauty in the cracks of things. Even after her body was laid to rest, her influence moved through the town like wind through open doors, subtle, invisible, unending. Her son Peter arrived some weeks later, his face drawn with grief, yet softened by recognition. He had always understood that his mother belonged more to the world of feeling and spirit than to the world of possession. Walking through her rooms, he touched the objects she had loved, a piece of turquoise she had once described as a shard of sky, a necklace of silver that caught the light like water, a small wooden carving she had bought from a local craftsman. On her writing desk, he found her journals, filled with entries written in her careful, slanting hand. They were not confessions, not explanations, but meditations, a map of a soul in search of itself. He spent hours reading them, his heart alternately heavy and lifted, for though her words spoke of solitude, they were never bitter. Instead, they radiated a strange, luminous peace. One passage struck him deeply. "We spend our youth trying to dazzle," she had written, "and our age trying to disappear. But perhaps the two are not opposites. Perhaps to dazzle is only to learn how to vanish beautifully." He closed the book and sat for a long while, the desert light shifting slowly across the floor. It was then that he decided her story could not end in silence. He would preserve what she had gathered, what she had loved, not as relics of wealth, but as fragments of her vision. From that decision, a legacy began to take shape, a place where others could come and feel the quiet radiance she had carried all her life. Thus, the idea for the Millicent Rogers Museum was born, not from grandeur, but from tenderness. Peter worked tirelessly, consulting her friends, collecting her letters, organizing her vast trove of art and jewelry. Every piece told a story of transformation, of encounter, of communion between worlds. The silver cuffs she had designed lay beside Native American works she had collected with reverence. European fabrics rested beside woven blankets from the Pueblos. Her own sketches, unsteady, delicate, hung quietly on the walls, reminders of the girl who had once dreamed alone by a window in New York. Visitors who later entered those rooms often remarked on the stillness, how the air seemed to carry a whisper, a trace of her presence that time could not erase. In the years that followed, her legend grew, shaped by memory and myth. The world that had once gossiped about her scandals now spoke of her as a visionary. Writers described her as the bridge between elegance and earth, artists as a soul sculpted by light. Fashion historians called her a muse of the modern age, a woman who had redefined luxury by stripping it of pretense. But those who knew her best said she was something simpler and rarer, a seeker who had never stopped listening to her own restlessness until it finally led her home. Her story returned again and again to the contrast that had always defined her, the glitter of the drawing room and the silence of the desert, the perfection of couture and the rough truth of handmade silver. To some, her journey seemed a series of contradictions. To others, it was one continuous thread, the evolution of a spirit that refused to accept confinement. Even in death, she seemed to move between worlds. Her jewelry appeared in galleries from New York to Santa Fe, her portraits in exhibitions celebrating the timeless elegance of an era now gone. Yet the heart of her story remained here, in Taos, where the wind still carried her name across the plains like a prayer. On certain evenings, when the sky turned the color of molten copper, the locals swore they could see her silhouette walking along the ridge above the town, a slender figure draped in shawls, her hair lifting in the breeze, her bracelets flashing like distant stars. Perhaps it was only a trick of light, the play of shadow and memory, but those who believed said it was her way of remaining, half presence, half echo, eternally wandering between the world she had escaped and the one she had found. Time, as always, softened the edges of her legend, but it never erased it. Scholars would later analyze her influence on design, collectors would debate the origins of her taste, and biographers would search her letters for evidence of scandal or redemption. But to understand Millicent Rogers was to look beyond those details. Her life was not a sequence of events, but a movement of spirit, a long, slow unfurling toward authenticity. She had been born into the shimmer of oil and industry, yet she died surrounded by dust and starlight, her beauty distilled into something purer than glamour. In that transformation lay her true artistry. Even now, decades later, her legacy endures not only in the museum that bears her name, but in the sensibility she left behind, the conviction that beauty, when honest, becomes truth. Designers still draw inspiration from her bold combinations. Historians still marvel at her prescience. But perhaps her most enduring influence is quieter still. The idea that style can be a form of philosophy, that how we choose to adorn ourselves can reveal how we wish to live. She had worn her contradictions as gracefully as she wore her jewels, turning both into symbols of freedom. And perhaps that is why her story refuses to fade. Each generation rediscovers her in its own way, seeing in her life the reflection of its own longing for meaning, for individuality, for grace amid impermanence. The heiress who once dazzled the salons of Europe has become a kind of spirit of endurance, her image shimmering between past and present, her voice carried by the wind that still moves through the high desert. On quiet nights when the moonlight silvers the mesas and the air grows still, one might almost hear her laughter, soft, distant, like the whisper of silk fading into sand. There are places in the world where time loosens its grip, where memory lingers longer than sound, and Taos was one of those places. Years after Millicent's passing, her presence could still be felt in the hush between wind and sunlight. The adobe walls of her home absorbed the centuries as easily as her laughter once had, and the silver she had worn seemed to retain a faint warmth, as if her touch still clung to it. Visitors often entered the house in silence, their footsteps soft on the worn floors, their eyes drawn to the windows where the desert stretched outward like an ancient sea. They spoke in low voices, not from reverence alone, but because the air itself seemed to insist upon quiet. The museum that bore her name grew gradually, almost organically, as if it, too, had to find its rhythm. There was no grandeur in its creation, no monumental marble halls or gilded inscriptions, only rooms of light and shadow arranged to reflect the arc of her life. Each display spoke with a kind of restraint, as she had in her final years. The curators, under the guidance of her son Peter, arranged her possessions not as trophies, but as fragments of a conversation. Her sketches beside Native American pottery, her jewelry beside the tools that had shaped it, her gowns displayed not as relics of fashion, but as translations of feeling. Visitors who wandered those rooms often felt they were moving not through history, but through a living consciousness, one that shifted with every glance of light upon silver or silk. The museum soon became a sanctuary for those seeking something beyond artifice. Artists came to study her designs, historians came to trace her lineage, and travelers came simply to stand in the quiet and breathe the air she once loved. The guides spoke softly of her life, of her transformation from heiress to seeker, from socialite to spirit of the desert. They told stories of her humor, her generosity, her delicate rebellion against the expectations of her time. Some listeners would smile knowingly, recognizing fragments of their own restlessness in her journey. Others would fall silent, as though the story had touched something nameless in them. Peter continued his mother's legacy with devotion. He walked often in the hills where she had once ridden, gathering stories from those who had known her, ensuring that her myth did not eclipse her truth. He understood that her life had not been one of perfection but of pursuit, that what made her extraordinary was not her beauty or wealth, but her courage to search without ceasing. In his later writings about her, he described her as a compass that pointed not north or south, but inward. And indeed, her influence seemed to guide those who came after her toward a deeper understanding of how art, fashion, and identity might merge into a single gesture of authenticity. The world beyond Taos continued to change. The decades rolled on, carrying with them new forms of glamour, new languages of beauty. Yet Millicent's spirit seemed untouched by time. Photographs of her appeared in magazines, exhibitions, and retrospectives devoted to 20th century style, each one capturing that same mysterious balance between refinement and wildness. Designers referenced her aesthetic, borrowing from her bold juxtapositions, her instinct for unity through contrast. In Paris, her name was spoken among those who revered originality. In New York, she was remembered as the woman who had shown that true elegance required not conformity, but conviction. Even in distant fashion schools, young students studied her image and felt, perhaps without fully understanding why, that she represented something rare, the harmony between artifice and truth. But those who came to Taos understood her differently. Here, amid the sagebrush and sun, she was not a figure of fashion but of philosophy. They saw not the heiress, but the woman who had walked barefoot through the dust, who had learned to find beauty in imperfection, who had turned away from the noise of her inheritance, to listen instead to the quiet language of the earth. Her jewelry, her clothing, her art, all of it spoke of reconciliation, of the meeting point between opposites. She had spent her life caught between the material and the spiritual, the temporary and the eternal. And in the end, she had woven them together as seamlessly as silver threads in sunlight. Sometimes, during the long afternoons when the heat shimmered above the desert, visitors would linger in the courtyard where she had once sat. The wind would rise suddenly, stirring the dust into small spirals, and someone would remark how alive the place felt, as if she had only stepped away for a moment. In the silence that followed, they would look toward the horizon where the mountains burned blue against the sky, and each would carry away a different memory, one of grace, another of solitude, another of quiet defiance. That was her gift, even in absence. She allowed others to find themselves through her story. Over the years, scholars wrote about her with varying certainty. Some called her a symbol of feminine emancipation, others a tragic beauty, haunted by the contradictions of privilege. Yet all agreed on one thing, that Millicent Rogers embodied a rare synthesis of worlds. She had taken the vocabulary of wealth and turned it into poetry, had transformed luxury into introspection. Her life was not the tale of a woman escaping society, but of one transcending it. She had seen the edges of both abundance and emptiness, and she had chosen finally to dwell where silence met light. It is said that one evening, long after her death, a storm passed over Taos, a storm unlike any in memory. The lightning struck far out on the plains, illuminating the mountains in brief flashes, and the rain fell in heavy, slanted sheets. When the storm cleared, the sky broke open into a wash of pale gold, and a double rainbow arched over the valley. Those who saw it later said that the air shimmered, the way it does when sunlight touches silver. For a few moments, the desert seemed almost to breathe again, as if the earth itself were remembering her. The Millicent Rogers Museum continued to grow, but always with humility. It remained a place of quiet, of subtle revelation, where visitors could stand before a single piece of jewelry or a photograph and feel, without needing explanation, that they were in the presence of something human and enduring. Her story was not displayed in grandeur, but in whispers, in textures, in the spaces between. And as the years passed, those who walked through its halls began to understand that her legacy was not about fashion or fortune, but about the possibility of transformation, of turning a life of expectation into one of creation, of turning loneliness into light. When the sun sets over Taos now, the museum's windows reflect the sky's fading colors, and for a fleeting moment they seem to glow with an inner flame. It is as if her spirit, woven into the fabric of this place, still catches the light just before it disappears. The wind rises, the doors creak softly, and the desert falls again into silence. The same silence she once called the truest luxury. The seasons continued to pass over Taos in their slow procession, each one tracing its own quiet signature across the land. In winter, frost silvered the sage, and the mountains stood like ancient guardians against a sky of endless glass. In spring, wildflowers pressed through the dry soil, their fragile blooms defying the austerity of the desert. The museum that bore Millicent Rogers' name seemed to breathe in harmony with those rhythms, its adobe walls glowing warm in sunlight, its cool interior holding the hush of reflection. It was no longer merely a repository of objects, but a kind of living prayer, a space where beauty could rest without explanation. People came from distant places to walk its rooms. Some were scholars, intent on tracing the chronology of her life. Others were wanderers who had heard of her and came seeking something they could not name. They found her in fragments, in a sketchbook filled with hurried lines, in a strand of turquoise polished smooth by time, in the faint scent of oil paint that still clung to the wood of an old easel. The curators kept the space deliberately sparse, allowing air and light to do the storytelling. A photograph of her standing against the vast sky of Taos hung near the entrance, her face both luminous and elusive, as though she were already halfway between this world and the next. Visitors often paused before that image. Some saw elegance, others melancholy, but most sensed something deeper. A calm forged from restlessness, the serenity that follows surrender. They spoke softly as they moved from one room to another, their footsteps echoing faintly. In one corner stood a case of jewelry that caught the afternoon light and scattered it across the floor in shards of brilliance. The silver cuffs, the heavy necklaces, the rings shaped like stars, all bore her mark. Not the mark of ownership, but of transformation. Each piece told a story of crossing, between wealth and wilderness, between refinement and rawness, between what is made by hand and what is made by heart. Over time, her story spread beyond the museum. Writers found her irresistible, a woman of contradictions who had lived as though beauty were both compass and curse. Books were written, films attempted, exhibitions curated, yet each retelling only deepened the mystery. For every fact that could be confirmed, her lineage, her marriages, her lovers, there remained something intangible that resisted capture. It was as if her true self had dissolved into the light of the desert, leaving only a shimmer where her outline once stood. Scholars debated her motives, her philosophies, her influence. Some called her a proto-feminist, others a romantic idealist. But those who had felt her presence in Taos knew better. They knew she was less a symbol than a question, one that asked how a person might reconcile privilege with purpose, beauty with truth, and solitude with love. The decades rolled onward, each one reinterpreting her legacy. In the post-war years, she became a muse for modernism. In the 70s, a precursor to bohemian freedom. In later decades, an icon of sustainability and cultural reverence. Fashion houses drew upon her daring juxtapositions. Museums cited her collections as visionary bridges between worlds. Yet beneath all these layers of homage lay something quieter, the recognition that she had lived not to impress, but to understand. Her art, her style, her restless search, all were forms of inquiry. She had not been trying to escape the world, but to see it clearly, to strip away illusion until only the essence remained. Sometimes, when evening settled over the desert and the museum closed its doors, the light inside would linger for a few moments longer, reflecting softly off the glass cases and the silver within them. The guards, locking up for the night, would pause and listen to the stillness. Outside, the wind moved gently through the mesquite, and the sky filled with stars so bright they seemed to hum. Those who knew the stories would smile to themselves, for they said that at such hours, Millicent's spirit wandered quietly through the rooms, touching the objects she had loved, ensuring they still caught the light in just the right way. Whether true or not, the idea comforted them. It seemed fitting that a woman who had sought beauty so tirelessly should continue to tend it, even in death. Peter, her son, aged into quiet dignity. He visited often, sometimes alone, sometimes with family. He would stand before her photograph for long minutes, his hands clasped behind his back, his face thoughtful. To him, the museum was not only a memorial but a dialogue between past and future, between mother and child. He ensured that it remained true to her vision, simple, open, reverent toward the cultures she had cherished. Before his death, he wrote one final note to be placed within her archives. "She taught me," he wrote, "that beauty is not what we keep, but what we allow to pass through us, to see without needing to possess." That was her art. As time carried their stories further into history, the edges of myth softened, but the essence remained. The young still came to Taos, drawn by something they could not articulate. They walked through the halls, touched by the sense of wholeness that emanated from imperfection. And outside, the desert continued its eternal rhythm, unchanged by human memory. At dawn, the light poured over the mesas in waves of gold. By dusk, it withdrew, leaving behind a hush so complete it could be mistaken for eternity. In that hush, one could almost believe that Millicent Rogers had not vanished at all, that she was simply there, watching, listening, existing as light does, without boundary. The hush of the desert deepened as years fell away, the same hush that had once drawn her from the glitter of cities to the solitude of open land. It seemed that the silence she had loved had now absorbed her completely, folding her memory into its wide embrace. The museum stood like a small heart of light in the vast plain, its windows glowing at dusk, its walls breathing gently with the warmth of the day. Those who tended it came to understand that it was not merely a house of artifacts, but a meditation, a place where one could feel the slow conversation between the human hand and the earth. The air carried her presence still, not as ghost or myth, but as tone, as mood, as the subtle gravity of something fully lived. There were nights when the wind rose from the canyon and moved through the courtyards with a low, unbroken hum. The sound found the hollow of the silver bracelets displayed in glass and made them sing faintly, a high whispering ring that vanished as quickly as it appeared. The caretakers hearing it would look up and smile without fear, knowing that it was only the wind, and yet perhaps not entirely only the wind. They spoke of her sometimes by lamplight, of the grace that had filled even her smallest gestures. They said that she had understood beauty not as possession, but as prayer, that she had lived in constant conversation with the invisible. Outside the museum, the town of Taos changed slowly. Roads lengthened, new houses rose among the cottonwoods, but the horizon remained untouched. The same pale ribbon of mountains, the same thin air filled with the scent of dust and sage. The world beyond became louder, more hurried, yet those who came to this place still felt compelled to slow their breath, to move with care. They walked the paths she had once walked, pausing where she might have paused, listening to the same wind moving through the dry grass. In that act of listening, they entered her rhythm, and for a moment the boundaries between past and present dissolved. Artists continued to find her, as though she were an unfinished conversation left open for them to join. Painters studied her photographs and tried to catch the same stillness. Sculptors traced her features in clay. Designers revisited her fearless combinations of culture and texture. Yet none could quite replicate what she had done, because what she created was not a style but a way of seeing. To her, every material carried memory. Every color held breath. She had worn her jewels as others wore beliefs, each one a statement of reverence. The turquoise was not mere ornament. It was a fragment of sky worn close to the pulse. The silver was not vanity. It was mirror, reflection, reminder of impermanence. Those who understood this came to regard her not as a muse, but as a teacher, though her lessons were never spoken, only shown in the living arrangement of her life. As decades passed, her image began to shift again. The films that used her likeness, the articles that reimagined her legend, all added layers of interpretation. Some made her an icon of rebellion, others a tragic heroine, others still a saint of style who had sought purity through aesthetics. Yet none could quite hold her. Her story slipped from each frame like light escaping a window. She had been too alive, too changeful to be contained by any single narrative. Even the objects she left behind seemed to alter subtly with time. Their surfaces caught light differently, their colors deepened, as if continuing her work in silence. In one of her journals, displayed beneath glass, a visitor might read the faint pencil line, "The soul wears the body, as the earth wears the sky." Scholars puzzled over its meaning, but those who lingered long enough in the room understood. She had seen life not as a division between matter and spirit, but as their constant intertwining. Her love for jewelry, for texture, for the tangible, was not vanity. It was worship of the physical as an expression of the eternal. The silver, the silk, the clay, the human form itself. These were her scriptures, and so she had lived her philosophy not in words or manifestos, but in gesture, in presence, in the way she moved through the world. At dusk, when the sun slipped behind the mountains and the sky turned the color of soft iron, the museum took on a quiet glow. The visitors left, the doors were locked, and the silence grew complete. Outside, the desert spread into darkness, its distances folding into one another until even the stars seemed near. On such evenings, those who passed by sometimes felt that the building itself breathed, expanding slightly with the night air, contracting again with the cool of dawn. Inside, her belongings rested as though asleep, the bracelets aligned like moons, the fabrics holding faint traces of her perfume, the sketches curled at their edges. Everything waited, and the waiting itself became a kind of prayer. Beyond the walls, life continued its slow weaving. Generations changed, fashions rose and fell, yet her presence remained constant in the weave. She was spoken of less as a person than as a feeling, a stillness that people recognized when they stood before beauty unguarded. The young who came knew her not through biography, but through atmosphere. They felt her in the rhythm of the land, in the way the wind met the hills, in the silver light before sunrise. They said that to encounter her story was to remember something already known, but long forgotten, the necessity of grace, the courage to live beautifully without reason. And so the world kept turning, the desert kept breathing, and Millicent's name, carried by the wind, became not a story told, but a silence shared. There were mornings in Taos when the light came so gently that it seemed not to rise, but to breathe. It seeped into the land like milk through sand, softening every edge, washing the desert in a pale calm. Those who lived there would wake to that light and feel, without knowing why, that they were stepping into a kind of memory. For in that stillness the essence of Millicent Rogers lingered, a presence not visible, yet unmistakable, folded into the air like a trace of silver dust. Her house, now woven seamlessly into the landscape, stood quiet among the sagebrush, its windows reflecting the dawn. It was as if the walls themselves remembered her touch, the echo of her footsteps, the hum of her voice when she spoke lowly to the wind. The museum had become a rhythm of its own, a breathing organism of light, shadow, and recollection. Each morning, the caretakers unlocked the heavy wooden doors and entered into its calm. They swept the floors, adjusted the curtains, and wiped the glass displays until the sunlight flowed cleanly over the silver and turquoise. In the early hours before visitors arrived, they often paused to listen, to the creak of old wood, to the whisper of wind against the adobe, to the faint, uncertain sound of their own hearts. There was something about the space that invited silence, as though speaking too loudly might wake the past. It was in those moments that Millicent's presence felt nearest, not as a ghostly apparition, but as a serenity that moved through the air, a sensation of being seen by someone invisible, yet kind. When the first visitors entered, their voices fell to murmurs without being asked. Some came for beauty, some for history, and some, though they might not have admitted it, for solace. They drifted through the rooms, their eyes tracing the delicate arc of a silver necklace, the careful fold of an embroidered shawl, the grain of a hand-carved frame. Each object carried the weight of intention. It was said that Millicent had never chosen anything thoughtlessly, that every piece in her possession had resonated with her spirit before it ever reached her hand. To stand among those objects was to glimpse the map of her inner life, where every texture and tone spoke of a feeling she could never fully put into words. Outside, the wind carried the dry scent of juniper, and the mountains, eternal and indifferent, glowed faintly in the distance. The rhythm of life in Taos was slow, circular, like the turning of a wheel, but within that rhythm, her name was constant. The old women of the town spoke of her with fondness, remembering the grace with which she had moved through the marketplace, her shawls fluttering like birds. The silversmiths told stories passed down from their fathers of how she had studied their craft with reverence, never as a collector but as a pupil. They said she listened to metal as if it could speak, and perhaps it could, for in her hands, silver seemed to soften, to carry warmth. Time, however, has its own patient erosion, and even legends fade at the edges. Yet Millicent's legacy did not vanish with the passing of those who knew her. It deepened, like color sinking into fabric. New generations came to her story not through gossip or glamour, but through a quiet recognition of spirit. In an age growing increasingly loud and hurried, she became, paradoxically, more modern than ever. Her belief that beauty could be both powerful and humble, that art should live in harmony with nature rather than above it, found new resonance in a world longing for meaning. She had lived her philosophy before it had a name, before it became fashionable to seek authenticity in imperfection. Writers continued to chase her image, as if trying to catch light in a jar. They described her as a desert saint, a philosopher of form, an artist whose medium had been her own existence. Yet the more they tried to define her, the more she eluded them. Perhaps that was her final act of artistry, to remain incomplete, to let the unknown be part of her beauty. Her letters, preserved in careful archives, offered glimpses but never conclusions. "We are all half finished," she once wrote, "and the most graceful thing we can do is to keep unfolding." Those words became a kind of motto for the museum, inscribed discreetly near the entrance, where the sunlight caught them each morning. In the afternoons, when the air grew still and the light turned to amber, the curators often opened the windows to let the wind move through the rooms. It stirred the edges of papers, lifted strands of silk, and carried with it the scent of sage. Sometimes it seemed as though the house itself was exhaling. Visitors would stop and listen, momentarily unsure whether the sound they heard was the wind or the faint rhythm of a woman's breath. A sense of peace settled over them then, fragile yet undeniable, as if the world had momentarily remembered how to breathe with gentleness. The evenings in Taos were long and luminous. The sky, vast and unending, stretched over the valley like a deep blue veil embroidered with stars. The town lights glimmered faintly, and beyond them, the desert melted into shadow. From the museum's courtyard, one could see the moon rise, slow and deliberate, casting its silver path across the ground. It was said that this was when Millicent was closest, when the world took on her favorite color, the soft metallic glow that lies between darkness and light. Those who worked there often stayed a few minutes after closing just to watch the moon climb higher, their breath visible in the cooling air. In that silence, they felt what she must have felt in her final years. That beauty was not in the object itself, but in the moment it revealed something eternal. And so her story continued, not as a tale of tragedy or triumph, but as a long breath of wonder stretched across generations. The desert kept her secrets, the museum guarded her memory, and the people of Taos, knowingly or not, carried her rhythm in their daily lives. When the wind passed through the canyons, they heard her laughter in its rise and fall. When the sunlight caught the curve of silver in a shop window, they saw a fragment of her smile. She had become, in some profound way, part of the landscape, neither saint nor shadow, but a shimmer, a warmth, a reminder that grace endures even as the world moves on. As the years drifted further from her time, the story of Millicent Rogers settled deeper into the soil of memory. Like rainwater sinking into the roots of sagebrush, there was no longer any separation between the woman and the landscape that had received her. Her house stood still, its adobe walls gently softening with each season, as though the wind itself had been entrusted with their keeping. The desert around it remained austere and infinite, the air dry and clear, carrying the same echo that had always filled her life, a longing, both delicate and fierce, both surrender and search. It seemed the world had not forgotten her, but rather had absorbed her, allowing her spirit to breathe in the spaces between silence and wind. There were those who came not to see her possessions or to study her legacy, but simply to stand in her light. They came from distant cities, from places she had once known, and from countries she had dreamed of but never reached. Each one carried their own question into the quiet of her rooms. What had she been seeking all her life? And had she found it here, in this stillness that stretched beyond words? Some found an answer in the artifacts themselves, feeling the warmth of her touch lingering in the silver she had loved. Others found it in the air, in the soft diffusion of light that made everything shimmer just slightly, as though the line between the visible and the invisible had thinned. Those who stayed longer began to sense something else, that her story was not a single arc but a series of awakenings. The young woman in the marble halls of New York, the restless wanderer in Paris, the muse among artists and aristocrats, the seeker in Taos. They were not separate lives, but successive forms of the same essence, like the phases of the moon reflecting one hidden light. What she had sought, perhaps, was not love or beauty, but coherence. The harmony between the outer shape of living and the inner shape of being. She had spent her years not collecting things, but collecting meanings, turning every sorrow, every departure into a refinement of understanding. Sometimes in the museum's archive, visitors would come across her letters, her handwriting elegant yet restless, the ink often fading at the edges. In one, she had written to a friend, "I think perhaps we are born with a hunger for the eternal, and we spend our lives mistaking it for other things, money, affection, fame, safety. But when all of these dissolve, we are left with what we were seeking from the beginning, the silence that does not leave." The words seemed almost prophetic, echoing through time with a clarity that needed no interpretation. They revealed that the woman once dismissed as an eccentric socialite had lived with the sensitivity of a philosopher, one who understood that beauty was not a possession, but a form of knowledge. Outside the walls of Taos, the world grew louder, its speed dizzying, Yet the desert did not change. Its patience was eternal, its horizon unbroken. The sun rose and fell in the same unhurried rhythm that had marked her final years. It painted the mesas gold in the morning and purple at dusk, turning each shadow into an act of quiet grace. The people who tended her museum often said they felt the desert teaching them in ways they could not describe, lessons of humility, of slowness, of presence. It was the same lesson Millicent had embodied in her last days, when she had said that to live fully was to let the world move through you without trying to hold it still. There were rare evenings when the museum closed later than usual, and the staff would remain behind to watch the light fade. They would sit in the courtyard where she had once sat, listening to the coyotes cry in the distance and to the faint rustle of the cottonwoods. Above them, the sky unfolded its immense indifference, vast and ancient. The moonlight touched the silver jewelry in the display windows, making it gleam like starlight caught in metal. In that moment, time seemed to dissolve, and they felt as though they were sharing the same silence that had comforted her. It was not sadness they felt, but a calm acceptance, the understanding that nothing truly disappears, it only changes its form. For those who studied her, the paradox of Millicent Rogers remained, that she had lived surrounded by extravagance, yet had sought simplicity with almost religious devotion. She had been celebrated for her beauty, yet had used it not to seduce but to express. She had been admired for her taste, yet had used fashion as language rather than armor. To some, her contradictions were confounding. To others, they were what made her luminous. She had shown that a woman of wealth could also be a woman of depth, that art could be both adornment and revelation, that life itself could be lived as a composition of textures and silences. As the 20th century passed into the 21st, her influence did not fade. It shifted like the changing light of Taos. Her name appeared again in articles, in exhibitions, in whispered conversations between designers and dreamers, who sensed in her story a pattern that felt eternal. They spoke of her courage to live outside her own time, to move with the instinct of a soul, listening to its own hidden rhythm. Young artists found in her a model for how to blend refinement with authenticity, elegance with spirit. Her image, reprinted in modern magazines, seems strangely alive still, as though her gaze, calm and knowing, were turned not toward the past, but toward the listener, asking gently whether they, too, had found their silence. In the final room of the museum, the one that looked out onto the open desert, there stood a single window left uncurtained. Through it, the horizon stretched endlessly, its colors shifting with each hour. Ochre, rose, then blue, fading into night. It was said that Millicent had chosen that window herself, that she had wanted nothing to block the view of the earth meeting the sky. "It is the only line I trust," she had once said. And indeed, that horizon remained the truest symbol of her life, a meeting point, a threshold, a balance between form and infinity. And so her story lived on, not as a monument, but as a movement of light, a story that refused to end. The desert wind continued its slow migration, the silver continued to gleam, and those who came to Taos continued to find themselves unexpectedly stilled, as though hearing a whisper from a century ago. Beauty is not what we see, but how we see it. It was the kind of truth that did not age, the kind that sank quietly into the soul, the way twilight seeps into the bones of the desert, leaving everything it touches faintly shining. In the long quiet of the desert night, when the stars hung low enough to touch the roofs of Taos and the air itself felt like a memory of light, the story of Millicent Rogers continued to breathe, softly, rhythmically, as if her presence had become one with the pulse of the earth. The wind moved over the sand and through the sparse branches of juniper, carrying the same secret sound she must have heard as she sat before her window in the final winters of her life. It was the sound of vastness, made intimate, of the eternal leaning close. Those who walked past her home after dark sometimes said that they could feel a stillness there unlike any other, a calm that seemed to hum just beneath the threshold of hearing. It was as if the house itself dreamed, its walls holding not the absence of life, but its distillation, a silence too full to be empty. Each dawn began almost imperceptibly. The sky turned from black to a deep silver blue, and then, with a softness that always felt new, the sun began to lift behind the mountains. The land awakened in layers, the faint call of a bird, the slow warming of the adobe, the whisper of light through the cottonwoods, and with each morning, the story of Millicent unfolded again, not as an ending remembered, but as a continuation. She had left no monument save her vision, and yet it proved more enduring than marble. The desert itself seemed to rise each day to meet her, offering its ancient clarity to anyone willing to look. Artists still came, carrying their paints and their cameras, their sketchbooks and their restlessness. They sought the light she had loved, that merciless, forgiving light that revealed everything without judgment. Some painted her home, others the mountains she had watched, and some tried to capture the silence itself, the impossible stillness that hovered between things. They said the air in Taos had weight, a tangible quiet that changed the way colors behaved. It made everything honest. It was this honesty, perhaps, that Millicent had pursued all her life. Not perfection, but truth stripped of ornament. Visitors to the museum would often write notes in the guest book, fragments of gratitude or wonder. "I came to see jewelry and found peace," one wrote. Another, "I think she still walks here." The curators never erased these remarks. They let them accumulate over the years, small echoes of lives momentarily aligned with hers. It was not uncommon for people to cry quietly in the rooms where her belongings were displayed, not from sadness, but from recognition. They saw in her life the reflection of their own searching, their own wish to live beautifully in a world that often forgets how. She had become, across time, a kind of mirror, one that did not flatter, but revealed. In one corner of the museum hung a photograph of her taken late in life, the kind where the light is soft and forgiving, yet unafraid to tell the truth. Her face, no longer youthful, possessed a radiance that had nothing to do with beauty as the world measures it. There was a depth in her eyes, a still intensity that seemed to see both inward and outward at once. Those who lingered before that photograph could almost feel her gaze meeting theirs, not judging, not asking, but understanding. She had looked at herself without fear, and in doing so, she had looked at all of us. Outside, life in Taos moved with its same ancient rhythm. The seasons arrived and departed with no announcement, each carrying its own form of silence. In summer, the air shimmered with heat, and the scent of pinon smoke drifted faintly through the evenings. In autumn, the cottonwoods burned gold before shedding their leaves into the slow river. Winter came with long shadows and the steady sound of wind against the adobe, and spring followed not with flourish, but with gentleness, as though even renewal must learn humility here. Through it all, the museum remained open, its rooms cool and calm, its windows framing the eternal horizon. Those who worked there began to understand that they were not merely preserving a legacy, but tending to a conversation between generations. The artifacts were not static, they breathed. Every bracelet, every piece of fabric, every letter she had written continued to speak, quietly but clearly, to those willing to listen. They spoke of transience and endurance, of art and love, of a woman who had learned that to adorn oneself could be not an act of vanity, but a declaration of faith in the visible world. She had taken what was fleeting and turned it into gesture, into symbol, into reverence. There were days when storms rolled in from the mountains, the sky darkening so suddenly that the light in the museum turned blue. Thunder would echo across the valley, and the air filled with the scent of rain. On those days, the curators would move slowly through the halls, checking that the windows were shut, their hands brushing against the glass cases. The rain fell heavy, drumming against the roof, and they would think of her, how she might have stood once at her own window, watching this same sky break open, her heart steady despite its frailty. She had always found beauty in what others feared: impermanence, change, the surrender of control. "The world," she once wrote, "asks only that we listen. Everything else we invent." And when the storm passed, as all storms do, the air cleared to a brightness almost holy. The desert, washed clean, gleamed under the returning sun, and the mountains stood renewed, their ridges dark and sharp against the light. The museum windows caught that brilliance and reflected it inward, across her silver, across her sketches, across her empty chair. It was in such moments that the caretakers felt most connected to her, as if she were reminding them that beauty, like peace, always returns after the storm, not because we deserve it, but because it cannot help itself. At night, when the world quieted once more, the stars would emerge in impossible numbers, filling the sky with their cold fire. The desert became a vast, breathing sea of darkness, and somewhere within that vastness, her story shimmered on, not as history, but as a kind of music, slow, patient, without beginning or end. Those who lay awake beneath that sky might imagine her walking still, her silver bracelets catching the starlight, her figure moving gracefully through the sand, neither leaving nor returning, simply existing in the eternal rhythm of the wind. There are moments in every story when time itself seems to hesitate, when the weight of memory grows so light that it almost disappears, leaving only breath and rhythm. In Taos, that hesitation could be felt at dusk, when the light folded gently over the mountains and the air turned to glass. The desert, vast and unhurried, seemed to remember her more as feeling than as fact. The shadows lengthened, and for a few precious minutes before night fell, everything appeared suspended, neither day nor darkness, neither past nor present. That was the hour Millicent had always loved most, the hour of balance when beauty belonged equally to light and to its loss. In those years after her passing, her presence no longer felt like a story being told, but like a weather that moved quietly through the soul. The museum no longer needed words to describe her. It breathed her language, the rhythm of restraint, the elegance of silence, the intimacy of attention. Visitors entered expecting grandeur and left speaking in whispers, as though the place itself had taught them reverence. They could not quite name what they had experienced, something like nostalgia, but softer, quieter, closer to recognition. It was as if she had distilled the essence of living into a single feeling, that life is precious precisely because it vanishes. The desert accepted her as it accepts everything, with patience without sentiment. Its vastness neither mourned nor celebrated her. It simply continued, reshaping her memory as it reshaped the wind. Her house slowly faded into the color of the land, its outlines blurring each season until it seemed less a dwelling than an extension of the earth. Her silver tarnished, her fabrics aged, yet somehow their beauty deepened. They began to look not like possessions, but like relics of an elemental faith, remnants of a conversation between woman and world. The passage of time, instead of erasing her, rendered her more complete. Writers came, seeking to define her, and found themselves undone by her quiet defiance. She had lived too fully in paradox to be captured by analysis. The heiress who rejected wealth, the beauty who refused vanity, the wanderer who finally chose stillness. Each version of her contradicted the last, and yet together they formed a harmony beyond logic. She was, in truth, a composition of opposites, fragility and strength, solitude and belonging, the refined and the raw. In her contradictions lay her coherence. To look at her life was to be reminded that truth is rarely singular. It glimmers like light on metal, shifting with every movement of the sun. One autumn afternoon, a group of students visited the museum, led by a professor who spoke softly of her contributions to art and culture. They listened politely as he explained her influence on design, her foresight in blending traditions long before it became fashionable. But when they entered the final room, the one that opened onto the horizon, they fell silent. Beyond the glass, the desert stretched endlessly, glowing under a low sun. The professor stopped speaking. One of the students stepped forward, her face lit with wonder, and whispered, "It feels like she's still looking." The others nodded, and for a long moment none of them moved. They stood there, watching the line where sky met land, and felt, without understanding, that they had been invited into something sacred. Outside, the wind picked up, stirring the dust into golden spirals. The air shimmered. It was the same light that had once fallen on Millicent's skin, the same wind that had carried the scent of sage to her open window. It was easy to imagine her there again, her profile outlined against the horizon, her shawl lifting in the breeze, her gaze turned toward a distance that belonged to no one. She had sought freedom all her life, and perhaps this was its truest form, to become inseparable from the elements themselves, to dissolve into what endures. In the evenings, when the curators closed the museum and the last visitors drifted away, they often lingered in that room. They would turn off the lights and let the final glow of sunset pour in. The silver jewelry caught the dying light and held it for a heartbeat before letting it fade. It felt like watching a soul exhale. No one spoke. The silence was not empty, but complete, filled with the hum of unseen continuity. Each night ended the same way, with the slow closing of the door, the soft click of the lock, and the understanding that nothing precious ever truly ends. The world outside of Taos moved restlessly forward, and yet her name appeared now and then, like a pulse beneath the noise of modern life. Designers invoked her spirit in their collections. Curators referenced her sense of fusion. Essayists quoted her lines about silence and beauty. But what endured most deeply was less her image than her idea, that the purpose of life is not to collect, but to refine, to strip away until only truth remains. She had lived according to that principle until the very end. Her final years an exercise in reduction, of possessions, of noise, of illusion, until she was left with nothing but her essential self, and even that she allowed to fade into light. There is a story told among the locals that on certain nights, when the air is clear and the moon is high, the desert reflects light in a peculiar way. Silver flashes briefly across the sand, then vanishes. Some say it is only the play of starlight. Others say it is her bracelets, carried by the wind. Whatever the truth, those who witness it describe the same sensation, a momentary stillness, a soft awareness that something eternal has brushed past them. They leave with a strange peace, the kind that comes when beauty and loss touch without conflict. And so, even as the decades unspooled, her presence did not wane. It thinned, became translucent, and in that translucence achieved permanence. She had once written that she wished to become transparent enough for light to pass through. In the end, she had. Her life, with all its contradictions, its passions, its quiet revelations, had turned to radiance, subtle, enduring, unseen yet everywhere. The desert, the museum, the people who remembered her, all of them shimmered faintly with that light, as if her final wish had been fulfilled, not to be remembered as a legend, but to be felt as a kind of grace. And when the night deepened fully, when the stars settled into their steady rhythm, and the wind withdrew into the valleys, the desert once more returned to silence. It was a silence not of absence, but of completion, vast enough to hold every echo she had ever made, gentle enough to let them fade. The line between her story and the world that contained it disappeared entirely, and what remained was the quiet truth she had spent her life seeking. That beauty, when it is honest, does not need to endure. It only needs to exist, once, perfectly, like the shimmer of light across a single breath of wind. Sometimes, when the morning sun broke over the mountains and the air was still cool enough to taste of night, the desert seemed almost translucent, as if made of light rather than earth. The horizon stretched clean and unbroken, and the long shadows of the mesas reached toward the sleeping town. It was at such hours that one could feel the texture of time itself, grainy, slow, filled with the scent of dust and awakening. The world seemed to breathe, and that breath carried within it the memory of Millicent Rogers, not as a name, nor as a story, but as a quiet current that lingered in the spaces between light and shadow. To the few who rose early enough to see it, her spirit did not seem gone. It seemed diffused, absorbed into the living rhythm of the desert that had once cradled her final years. There was something eternal about the landscape she had chosen, a stillness that refused to vanish even under the weight of change. The highways stretched further now, the cars moved faster, and yet the air of Taos remained untouched, full of that particular clarity that makes the smallest details shimmer. The curve of a rock, the soft glint of mica in the soil, the faint rustle of dry grass in the wind. It was easy to understand why Millicent had come here seeking peace. The land asked nothing, promised nothing. It simply existed in its infinite patience, allowing anyone who entered it to see themselves more clearly. And perhaps that was her final lesson, that peace is not found in the absence of movement, but in the acceptance of impermanence. As the years passed, the museum continued to stand as a beacon of that quiet acceptance. Each day, its doors opened to a stream of visitors, some curious, others reverent, others simply wandering without knowing why they had come. They walked through the rooms where her life unfolded in fragments, a sketch here, a dress there, a photograph with eyes that seemed to know too much, and though the objects were inert, there was nothing lifeless about them. They radiated a kind of intimacy, as though they remembered being touched, worn, chosen. Those who lingered could sense in each object the invisible line that ran through all she had loved, the idea that beauty was not luxury, but language, a form of speaking with the world when words were too heavy to use. There was a certain irony in how she had lived and how she was remembered. The woman who had been defined by movement, across continents, across loves, across the shifting seasons of her own heart, was now rooted in one place, her story preserved in glass and adobe. Yet even in stillness she moved. Each generation that discovered her brought new interpretations, new reflections, as if she continued to evolve with time. Some saw her as a pioneer of style, others as a philosopher of form, others still as a restless spirit who had tried to reconcile grace with grief. But beneath all those readings, there remained the undeniable truth of her humanity. Fragile, searching, unfinished. Sometimes the curators would find letters from visitors tucked quietly into corners of the museum, written on postcards, on the backs of brochures, on scraps of paper folded carefully as offerings. They were addressed to her, though they knew she could not read them. "Thank you for teaching me that solitude can be beautiful," one said. Another, "I think you would have understood my heart." And another, simpler still, "I came to see your jewelry but found myself." The staff collected them without comment, placing them in a small box that grew heavier each year. It seemed fitting that her legacy continued not in lectures or accolades, but in these quiet exchanges between strangers and silence. Outside, the seasons continued their patient cycle. Spring arrived softly, the cottonwoods flickering green against the pale hills. Summer brought heat that shimmered like a mirage, bending light until even distance seemed uncertain. Autumn burned gold, and the air filled with the dry sweetness of sage. Winter, when it came, was absolute, the snow smooth as silk over the land, the air still enough to hear the faint echo of one's own breath. Through all these changes, the desert remained the same and different all at once, a paradox Millicent herself would have understood. She had spent her life trying to live inside that balance, to find beauty not in perfection, but in the dialogue between what fades and what endures. Her son's dream of preserving her spirit through the museum had succeeded beyond his expectation, yet even he might not have foreseen how it would become more than a tribute. It had turned into a threshold, a space where those who entered could, if only briefly, feel the still pulse of something eternal. It was not about her wealth or her beauty, not even about her art. It was about the state of being that she had discovered here at the end, the clarity that comes when one finally stops reaching. In her last years, she had ceased trying to belong to the world and had instead let the world belong to her, in silence, in surrender, in awe. On quiet afternoons when the sun hung low and the rooms filled with a honey-colored light, one could almost imagine her seated there once more, her face turned toward the window, her hands resting lightly in her lap. The silver at her wrists would glint as she moved, catching the light in small bursts like captured breath. Outside, the wind would whisper through the grass, and the sky would open wide and endless. She would not speak, she rarely needed to, but there would be, in her stillness, that same invitation she had always offered to those who looked at her too closely, to slow down, to see, to listen. And then, as evening fell and the color drained gently from the sky, the light would touch the horizon for the last time before sinking. The air would cool, the mountains would fade into silhouettes, and the first stars would appear, unhurried and bright. Somewhere in that fading light, her spirit would seem to move again, not as memory but as rhythm, carried on the breath of the land she had loved. And those who walked the quiet roads of Taos would feel it, an unseen grace moving beside them, as constant and as gentle as the turning of the earth. As night spread once more across the New Mexican plain, the wind that passed over the open fields carried with it a sense of old familiarity. It was the same wind that had brushed against Millicent Rogers' hair when she walked through the desert paths at dusk, the same current that had moved through her rooms and stirred the silver trinkets on her table with a faint music of their own. It moved freely now, unburdened by time, whispering through the town like a voice remembering itself. The air tasted of sage and faint smoke from distant fires, and though the world had changed beyond what she might have imagined, the desert did not concern itself with the passing of decades. It remembered only the essential, the light, the silence, the breath of those who had loved it deeply. The people of Taos had grown accustomed to her being everywhere and nowhere at once. Her name belonged to their history now, yet she was not confined by it. She existed as an echo woven into daily life, a presence that might be felt in the hush before sunrise, or in the shimmer of heat above the road, or in the soft click of jewelry worn by women who never knew her, but understood her instinctively. They felt her not as a ghost, but as a companion in the shared experience of beauty. For she had taught, by example, that beauty was not something to be owned, but something to be noticed, to be honored in passing. She had left no commandments, only a way of seeing. Sometimes, children born long after her time would wander the museum with their parents, their hands pressed to the glass of the display cases, staring at the necklaces and earrings that glowed faintly in the afternoon light. They did not yet know her name, but they sensed something quiet in those rooms, a softness that stilled even their restless curiosity. They would whisper to their mothers, "Did she wear these?" And their mothers would nod, not explaining further. The children would then turn toward the window that looked out over the mountains and stand still, as if listening to something beyond hearing. Perhaps they felt what she had once felt, that strange pull between earth and sky, that awareness of being small yet infinite. The curators spoke of her rarely among themselves. They did not need to. Her presence was woven into the very rhythm of their work, the polishing of silver, the careful unfolding of fabrics, the turning of pages so old the ink had begun to fade into paper. Each task was an act of devotion, though none of them would have used that word. They had learned that her spirit preferred understatement, that reverence expressed too loudly might startle it away. So they worked quietly, and the museum breathed in its own slow, deliberate tempo, as if time there moved by the laws of another world. There was a window near the rear of the house, one that faced the high desert plain. From there, the light changed constantly, brilliant and harsh at midday, tender and gold in the evening, cool and silvery when the moon rose. It was said that Millicent had once sat by that very window, sketching in the dim light, her eyes following the slow migration of the clouds. The locals believed that the view itself was part of her story, that it had shaped her just as surely as Parisian salons and New York drawing rooms had done. The land had stripped her of pretense, leaving only truth, and perhaps it was for this reason that those who came to Taos often left changed. They did not find the polished myth of an heiress. They found a reflection of their own search for authenticity, for the quiet center within the noise. In the small-town library, a rare copy of her letters remained, its pages brittle with age. Visitors who opened it were struck by the clarity of her thought, the tenderness beneath her restraint. She wrote of the desert's astonishing silence, of the weight of light upon the skin, of how she had come to see her life as a series of gestures in search of truth. There were lines that seemed to hum with recognition across the years. I have learned that beauty cannot be saved. It must be experienced, like breath, again and again. Those who read them found themselves pausing often, not out of confusion, but because the words demanded stillness. They were not meant to be analyzed, but absorbed. Outside, the wind would rise again, and the sky would deepen into color, a palette she had once worn upon her wrists and neck, the silver of twilight, the turquoise of distant peaks, the amber of the dying sun. Her fashion, they realized, had always been more than adornment. It had been a dialogue with light. Even now, her influence could be felt in how artists used texture, in how designers blended contrasts, in how photographers sought that elusive meeting point between glamour and truth. She had not invented beauty, she had listened to it. And because she listened so completely, beauty had followed her, even into death. As evening fell, a few locals would gather outside the museum steps, sharing small talk before heading home. They would look toward the fading horizon, and one of them might mention her name, almost absent-mindedly, as though she were a neighbor who had simply gone away for a while. She'd have loved this light, someone would say, and the others would nod. They didn't need to elaborate. In that moment, as the last light spilled across the land, they could almost see her, standing there, a slender figure draped in soft fabric, her gaze steady, her bracelets catching the glow. It was only a trick of dusk, perhaps, or the mind's way of comforting itself. But for those who saw it, the sight carried no fear, only recognition. When night finally came, it did not fall suddenly, but with a tenderness that seemed to honor her. The stars emerged one by one, until the sky was a vast silver field. The moon hung low and luminous, and for a moment it was easy to imagine her presence drifting through the cool air. A whisper, rather than a vision, a continuation, rather than a return. The desert was quiet, save for the sound of the wind against the dry grass. And in that vast stillness, one could feel how small and how immense a single life could be, how it could leave no trace and yet illuminate everything. Millicent Rogers had once written that to live beautifully is to vanish beautifully. And somewhere beneath that endless sky, it seemed she had. There are nights in Taos when the air becomes so clear that distance disappears, and the stars seem not suspended above, but woven into the very breath of the desert. On those nights, the quiet is so complete, It feels like the whole world is listening to its own heartbeat. The adobe walls, the mesas, the thin silver thread of river, everything stands in a single listening stillness. It is then that one senses her most keenly, as if her presence has merged entirely with the dark. She had once sought this very stillness, wandering restlessly through ballrooms and cities, through laughter and loss, searching for what could not be found in the noise of the world. Now she belongs to this silence. The desert, with its infinite patience, had become her final language. Long after the last visitors had left the museum, the rooms remained filled with a faint afterglow, not from lamps or candles, but from something subtler, the memory of attention. Each object seemed to hold its own breath, as though aware of its purpose. The silver gleamed faintly under the moonlight that filtered through the high windows, and the fabrics lay still, folded like memories of movement. The air smelled faintly of dust and sage, that eternal fragrance of the high country. If one stood very quietly, one could almost hear the rhythm of her life in that silence. The distant echo of laughter from New York salons, the slow footsteps on marble floors, the rustle of silk and the low hum of violins, all fading into the hum of wind and starlight. Her story did not end with her death. It dissolved into this continuity, this seamless blending of human and landscape, of art and air. At dawn, the light returned as it always did. Gentle at first, then insistent, climbing the walls, brushing across the jewelry cases, reawakening everything it touched. The curators would arrive, unlocking the doors and stepping softly through the rooms that felt less like a museum than a sanctuary. They tended to their work without haste, knowing that what they cared for was not just a collection, but a soul extended through objects. It was difficult to explain this to outsiders. They were not simply preserving artifacts of wealth or style. They were preserving a way of seeing, a consciousness that had once turned even suffering into beauty. To keep her memory alive was not to keep her frozen, it was to allow her transformation to continue through others who came seeking the same peace. Outside, life moved on with its quiet rhythm. Children played in the dust, artists set up their easels beneath the cottonwoods, the mountains shifted color with every hour. There were moments when the wind rose suddenly, scattering the sand into soft spirals that shimmered for a heartbeat before falling back to earth. The locals said that this was her way of reminding them to look up, to notice, to pause. And they did. They paused because there was something about this place that refused to let one hurry. The desert demanded presence. It refused distraction. It spoke the same truth Millicent had once embodied, that life, in all its fleeting beauty, is meant to be lived deliberately, not consumed. Those who studied her life often tried to find a central meaning in it, a sentence that could contain her. But no single phrase could hold her contradictions. She had been born into a dynasty built on oil and ambition, yet she had spent her life unlearning power. She had been surrounded by mirrors, yet had searched only for transparency. She had been worshipped for her beauty, yet had used it not to seduce but to question what beauty meant. Her story was not one of escape, but of return, the long return to simplicity, to elemental truth. And in that return, she had found what most spend their lives chasing without realizing it, a belonging that asked for nothing but awareness. Scholars continued to debate her significance. Was she a feminist before her time, a visionary artist, a restless spirit undone by her own longing? Perhaps she was all of these things, or perhaps none. The desert, which holds no need for definitions, might answer differently. To the land, she was not symbol or myth, but a participant, a creature of feeling who, in her final years, finally moved in harmony with the earth beneath her feet. She had entered into rhythm with the wind and the light, and once that rhythm took her, she never left it. To the desert, she was simply another part of its song. Visitors sometimes brought offerings, small tokens left discreetly along the path near her home. A sprig of sage, a piece of turquoise, a handwritten note folded into stone crevices. None of this was asked for, yet it continued, as if some instinct compelled them to honor her with gestures rather than words. And perhaps this was fitting, for her life had always been expressed more through gesture than declaration. The tilt of her head, the way she wore silver beside silk, the way she paused before answering a question, these small acts had contained more truth than speeches or manifestos ever could. Her legacy had always been tactile, alive in the touch of things. At night, the museum's walls glowed faintly from within, holding warmth even after the last light had faded. The stars outside glittered with the same pale clarity she had loved, and the desert stretched outward, unbroken, endless. From certain distances, the building seemed less a structure than a lantern, its soft illumination pulsing gently against the dark. And perhaps, in some way, that was what she had become. A light that endured without demanding notice, quiet but unwavering, guiding those who sought not grandeur, but grace. In the still hours before dawn, when the cold settled deeply and even the coyotes fell silent, the land would rest entirely. The wind would stop and the world would seem to hold its breath. It was then that her presence felt most complete, not as memory but as element. The faint shimmer in the air, the whisper of silver hidden beneath the dust, the unbroken calm that held everything together. She had become what she had always admired most, something both delicate and eternal, visible only to those who truly looked. And though her story belonged to the past, her essence belonged wholly to the now, to the endless unfolding of light across the sleeping desert, to the soft insistence of beauty persisting through time. In the first light of morning, when the desert was neither night nor day, but some quiet, golden threshold between them, the story of Millicent Rogers seemed to breathe once more through the air itself. The sun lifted slowly, spilling its pale fire over the mountains and washing the valley in a warmth so delicate it felt like the beginning of the world. There was no sound save for the faint whisper of wind moving across the grass, and in that silence, it was easy to imagine that her spirit still lingered here, gentle, luminous, woven into the light. Nothing about her presence demanded attention. It was felt rather than seen, known rather than remembered, like the hush that follows a prayer. She had lived her life as one long gesture toward beauty, and now that gesture had expanded beyond her body, beyond her time, until it had become indistinguishable from the rhythm of the land itself. It was in this hour that the museum often felt most alive. Before the first visitor arrived, before the footsteps and whispers of admiration, the rooms seemed to hold a kind of secret communion. The sunlight slipped across the adobe walls, turning their surfaces to honey, then to ivory. The glass cases caught the light and fractured it softly, scattering silver and blue across the floor like fragments of her favorite jewelry. Each object seemed to hum faintly in the stillness, as though memory itself were vibrating in the air. Here was her necklace of turquoise and silver, glowing with a quiet, earthen dignity. Here was the gown she had worn in her final portraits, its folds as graceful as a sigh. The world she had left behind was still here, breathing through texture and form. Outside, the desert stretched into distance, a vast and unhurried ocean of light. The mesas caught the rising sun and flared crimson for a brief moment before softening again into brown and gold. In the far distance, a hawk circled, tracing invisible spirals against the endless sky. There was a harmony to this landscape that echoed everything she had sought: order without control, beauty without ownership, movement without noise. And in that realization lay the quiet truth of her life: that freedom is not found in having, nor even in leaving, but in belonging completely to the moment that holds you. She had spent decades chasing that understanding through art, through love, through the delicate architecture of style, and in the end she had found it here, in the simplicity of wind and earth. Her influence even now continued to ripple outward, subtle yet enduring. Artists and thinkers spoke her name with a kind of reverence, not as one remembers a celebrity, but as one recalls a teacher whose lessons were absorbed more through presence than instruction. Designers still invoked her spirit when creating pieces that dared to blend contradictions. Luxury and humility, tradition and rebellion, the handmade and the divine. To them, she remained a muse, not because of her beauty, but because of her integrity of vision. She had lived as if art and life were inseparable, as if the truest design was the one composed from sincerity. The world that once celebrated her scandals now celebrated her wisdom, though she would have smiled at the irony, for she had never sought to be understood, only to be authentic. And authenticity, she knew, was something that revealed itself only to those who had learned to be quiet. The museum's guides spoke often of her love for the land, of how she had said that Taos gave her a new kind of faith. "It made me see," she had written, "that the world does not ask for perfection. It only asks for awareness." In those few words lay the essence of her philosophy, the idea that beauty and truth were not destinations, but states of attention. She had lived her life as an act of seeing, and because she had seen so deeply, her gaze still shaped the world she left behind. To walk through her rooms was to feel that gaze turn gently upon you, asking only that you look as she once did, without judgment, without greed, with eyes open to the wonder of what is. As evening approached, the desert shifted again. The sun sank slowly, dissolving into amber and rose, then deepening into violet. The air cooled and the first stars appeared above the mountains, one by one, deliberate as blessings. The museum's windows reflected the fading light, glowing briefly before surrendering to the dusk. Outside, the wind carried the faint scent of sage and cedar, and the land seemed to exhale. In that vast exhalation, everything felt at peace. Her story, long told and retold, had reached its quiet completion, not in an ending, but in a merging, where memory became landscape and the self became horizon. The caretakers locked the doors for the night, and as they stepped away, the building seemed to pulse faintly in the moonlight. Inside, her belongings rested in their stillness, but nothing about that stillness was lifeless. It was the stillness of something fulfilled, something that had found its final form in calm. The silver lay quiet, the fabric slept in folds of shadow, the air itself felt gentle and complete. And beyond those walls, the desert stretched into infinity, radiant and unafraid. Somewhere in that expanse where the mountains met the stars, one could almost sense her walking still, her figure moving with the grace of wind, her bracelets chiming softly in the dark, her face turned toward the horizon. The woman who had once carried the weight of her inheritance, the ache of her own heart, and the endless curiosity of her spirit had become part of something vaster than any legacy. She was not gone. She had simply become transparent, allowing the world to shine through her. And so her life, with all its longing and radiance, returned to the silence from which it had begun, the silence of morning light, of silver and shadow, of wind tracing its invisible patterns across the earth, a silence that was never emptiness, but presence itself, the final art she had mastered, the truth she had spent her life chasing. Her story remains, not in the telling, but in the listening. For those who pause long enough to hear it, the desert still whispers her name, soft as breath, enduring as light.